Chapter 2152. Published at 14th of September, 2023, 5:46 and 1 second AM. Chapter 2152. My seed. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's spear dazzled the world, but his body cracked apart just releasing it. The roars of rage and helplessness of several ancestors echoed like a symphony to his ears. The surge overwhelmed everything in its path, and it was only after seeing this that Lionel's body couldn't sustain itself, falling to the ground. He barely held himself up, leaning on his one leg and the butt of his spear as he looked forward. He didn't even bother to use instant recovery. He knew that it was helpless against these kinds of injuries. The blows of eighth-dimensional ancestors weren't something that he could handle. When the lights faded, the world fell into an endless shock. Dozens of ancestors had come, but only 3 heavily injured ones remained. The leader of the nomad race, Charnos. The leader of the cloud race, Lufiel. And the leader of the beast domain, the Cerebos serpent. They looked as though they were standing on their last legs, but the devastation on their faces when they saw the death around them was hard to put into words. It all felt like a dream. They had come with such momentum, only to end up like this? How was that even possible? It was all him. It was all him. No matter how much they thought that Lionel had relied on others before, they didn't feel that it made sense to continue on with these thoughts. If he wasn't at least a part of these matters, why would the human domain put such important power in his hands? If they had done this with an actual ancestor, would even they be able to survive? The worst part was that they realized they had all been lured here. From the very beginning, this was Lionel's goal. He wanted them to lose themselves to rage, to abandon their people and to come here in full force, and most importantly together. If they were scattered, it would have been much easier for them to escape and much fewer would have died. But because of their choice, Lionel was able to round them all up and slaughter them as though their lives were as worthless as cannon fodder. The image was something that the human domain would never forget. The Cerebos serpent roared into the skies, its fury causing its scales to lift up and retreat again, and again as though its body itself was inhaling and exhaling. It wanted to shred Lionel to pieces, and when it saw that Lionel could hardly hold himself anymore, it couldn't hold back any longer. Lionel took deep, heaving breaths. That battle had only lasted for a short moment, but it was the most intense one he had ever been a part of. With the speed of ancestors, 7 minutes was the equivalent to days to lower-level dimensional beings. The amount of exchanges was too many to count. When he saw that the Cerebos serpent was going to attack him, he chuckled. He really didn't have anything left. That said, bang! The Cerebos serpent was sent flying. Before Lionel, a gorgeous woman with flowing golden hair had appeared, her expression livid. Her son had been just fine when he entered the bubble of darkness, but when he came out he had practically been half dead. The moment she saw this, Eleanor couldn't see anything else but red. She had wanted to interfere earlier, but this son of hers was an enigma. She didn't want to disrupt his plans, but she hadn't expected him to be so absolutely reckless. She threw out 3 more palms in quick succession. The 3 heads of the Cerebos serpent burst with a rain of blood and flesh. Its body was thrown back even further, but it was actually buried into the ground at the same time, causing it to remain much closer to Eleanor than it should have. Maybe in its peak state, the Cerebos serpent wouldn't be left in such a sorry state. However, after withstanding that attack from Lionel, it had already been on its last legs. Against an enraged Eleanor, it seemed that it could do nothing at all. Seeing this scene, without hesitation, the nomad race and cloud race ancestors rushed off into the distance. But they couldn't even make it far before Eleanor appeared before them, striking around twice. Eleanor had hardly finished her attack when her pupils constricted. NOVEL//CO. And without hesitation, she clapped her hands together, a large bubble of green instantly forming around her. Bang! An attack came from seemingly nowhere, and crashed against the barrier, shattering it into pieces. Lionel's expression changed, but his heart settled down immediately as his mother appeared by his side. Before Lionel could understand what had happened, a blazing aura suddenly pierced the skies. To his astonishment, the cloudy grayness of the void battlefield that had never once dispersed was split, revealing an endless dark abyss above as this aura continued to grow. Who the fuck dares to attack my wife? A beam of light pierced through the skies, the very fabric of the void battlefield tearing in two as though reality itself was being split. The beam disappeared into the distance, and there was suddenly nothing but silence. Eleanor frowned, placing a hand on Lionel's shoulder. A green bubble formed around Lionel, and all of the eighth-dimensional force he couldn't handle was expelled. Instant recovery. As Lionel recovered, he tilted his head into the skies and watched as his father appeared. Velasco was completely enraged. Every step he took shattered the ground beneath him despite the fact he had to be several kilometers in the air. He grasped out, the folds of reality that were quickly repairing themselves suddenly shattering again. All at once, countless figures that had been hiding seemed to have been ejected from their hiding places. Even if they were countless kilometers away, they were all brought forward. These were individuals that Lionel couldn't recognize in the slightest. Most of them, anyway. But there were two that caused his eyes to narrow. The first was a lovely woman protected to the back of an expert that must have stood at least 4 meters tall. She was a woman he had only met once before, but the impression she had left was deep. Anya. The second was a man that should have long since been dead, however he had had his own thoughts about this matter. When he had taken out Monkey from the snow globe and he had immediately died, he realized that someone must have interfered. If they could interfere to kill Monkey, they could definitely interfere to save someone with a soul as powerful as this man's. He was none other than the savant of Earth, the so-called Lionel Morales. However, Lionel's father didn't seem to care to see any of them. Even eighth-dimensional experts were beneath his notice, let alone seventh-dimensional existences like Anya. This number of experts was even greater than the number that had appeared across all the invaders. These people could only be of one group, the scholars of the three-finger cult. But once again, Velasco didn't seem to notice at all. His hand continued to grasp at the air, and one of the scholars was ripped forward out of his own control. He was sucked into Velasco's palm and crumbled to pieces before even making contact. Velasco only now seemed to notice that there were others around him. The sneer that hung from his lips showed disdain for the very world itself. Sending this sort of trash to face me? Even my seed just killed over 50 of you. What do you think I can do to you? Urdiel's note. Elamio Velasco is the GOAT. Chapter 2153. Published at 14th of September, 2023, 5:45 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 2153. A perfect creature. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The scholars of the three-finger cult outnumbered even the number of invaders that had appeared earlier. Each of them wore scholarly red robes, their shoulders graced by ribbons that made it look more like they were on their way to graduate from a prestigious college rather than about to unleash a slaughter on the human domain. Lionel's face couldn't help but contort with disdain. What trash uniforms. Seriously uncool. Who decided on this design? Don't you all feel embarrassed? The atmosphere was quite tense at the moment, especially after the momentum of Velasco's strength settled in. These people had spent their lives hearing stories about this man, many of them even disparaging him as a weakling behind closed doors. However, standing face to face with him now, they couldn't seem to find those words ridiculous. When that feeling was suddenly fueled by Lionel's disdain-layered words, these stone-faced scholars almost blushed with shame. If it wasn't for their supreme control, many really would have shown such an expression, but they just barely managed to ignore Lionel. Velasco looked down toward Lionel, shaking his head. If there was one thing this son of his was good at, it was pissing people off, and that apparently included even him. He had just said such a cool one-liner, and yet the show was stolen by this brat. Lionel grinned when he saw his father's gaze. There's quite a lot of corpses here, old man. How about you tell them to bring King out? I could probably deal with them all on my own. Your bones are getting a bit weak. Maybe you should go back and relax with Mom. When Lionel said the word King, the scholars that had been trying to ignore him all had a change in expression. Is that a name that you can say? The sudden roar came from a scholar who stood at the helm. The ripples of his voice left trails through the air. This person was without a doubt a powerhouse even amongst ancestors. However, before the echo reached Lionel, Eleanor raised a hand, her frown deep. Lionel's gaze landed on his mother's wrist, noticing just how much effort it had taken his mother to do that despite the casualness of her actions. His gaze flashed with a dangerous light as he looked up. "I've yet to come to collect the debt the three-finger cult owes me, but it seems that you're actually so eager. Someone actually dares to call themselves king when I exist in this world. And you're mad that I said his name? That's about as much respect as I have for that sore loser." The eyes of the scholars opened wide. How could they not know what Lionel was referring to? What else could it be if not the love triangle of the Silver Emperor, King, and the Demoness? They had all been alive for more than long enough, and been part of the three-finger cult upper echelon for enough time, to be aware of these sorts of secrets. But they didn't even dare to say King's name, who would actually dare speak about such things aloud. However, they were focused on the wrong thing. Bang! The head of the scholar who had just roared suddenly exploded. It came without warning, the only marker being the simple flick of a finger. Velasco slowly lowered his hand, his expression indifferent. The most powerful of the scholars was crushed in a single movement, as though he wasn't worth more than a single glance. The gap was so exaggerated that the remaining scholars explosively retreated, their expressions turning heavy. "It seems you all take my presence too lightly. That's strike two already." The scholars fell into silence, the beating of their hearts being the only thing they could hear. The rushing of their blood seemed to encapsulate their entire world. Velasco took a step forward, and a scholar was shattered to pieces. He took another, and yet another fell. He took a third step and a third body exploded, filling the skies with a rain of blood. Even Lionel had forgotten that there was a broadcast to the human domain currently. When he finally did, he clicked his tongue. He had put so much effort into looking cool, and it was all ruined by this old man. Who would remember him after this? The legend of Velasco, which had been brewing in the hearts of many for countless words, suddenly exploded. It was one thing when Lionel relied on the help of other ancestors to defeat others, but it was a completely different matter to kill with such casualness. Another step and a fourth died, then it was a fifth, then a sixth. It hadn't even been more than a few minutes, and yet 10% of their people had fallen. It didn't even seem like Velasco was in a hurry to kill him. It felt more like he was on a leisurely stroll, moving through the world without a care, and taking lives for no other reason than the fact it felt convenient to do so. Lionel, however, was thinking about something else. His father seemed to be trying to lure something out. There were many things about his father's actions that he didn't understand. Many of those matters also happened to revolve around the three-finger cult. His father was so intelligent and powerful, and he seemed to be mowing down the three-finger cult as though they were worthless. So why did the three-finger cult still exist? There was something else at play here. All of a sudden, the skies were filled with a blinding, golden flash. Lionel looked up and past where his father had been standing, and watched as maybe the most perfect creature he had ever laid eyes on slowly appeared. This creature was a man wearing golden robes. He stood unblemished and untouched by nature, and yet as one with it at the same time. The anarchic force around him dispelled naturally for no other reason than his very existence. No/vel/usb/co. Lionel had thought the most handsome man he had ever seen was wise start order. But now even he felt wholly inferior. A spiritual. Chapter 2154. Published at 14th of September, 2023, 5:45 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 2154. Emperors. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's gaze narrowed. The spirituals hadn't shown up for the invasion, but had shown up now? And it was just one man? What did this mean exactly? Were they related to the three-finger cult? Or was this precisely the king he had been asking for? But that didn't make any sense. Lionel was over 90% certain that King came from the Cataclysm Zone, or more accurately, the so-called True World. This was why he and the Demoness could have lived for so long. It was all a matter of relying on the huge time dilation between the two regions. Over a year had passed since Lionel had exited that zone, but maybe only a few fractions of a second had passed over there. That was the reality. Why did this mean? It made little sense for this man to be king. Lionel didn't know what race it was that had created this simulation, but if he had to guess, it would definitely be the humans. The reason for this was the way this world was set up, and how all of the other races seemed to have perfectly set and defined paths to take, while the humans were meandering and somewhat aimless. If one had to run a simulation, constraining the variables made no sense. They would be looking for something that could change the status of their current situation. And constraining the subjects would make little sense. Rather, they would more so want to allow the simulations as much freedom as possible, allowing the chance for spontaneous mutations that could result in changes that they could take advantage of to help them out of their current situation. Lionel was even more certain of this because of what had happened in his last moments in the Cataclysm Zone. Back there had been many seventh-dimensional experts present, trying to stop him, but not a single eighth-dimensional expert. That event was far too important for not even one eighth-dimensional existence to show up. And given what Lionel had done and said about the ancestor who had brought Aina, it was even more impossible that she would do nothing. So where had she been? With the sudden breakthrough of his mind, he had a secondary experience of what he had gone through the very first time he had awakened Dream Force. And that was an amplification of his memory. Suddenly the snap sound that everyone could seem to hear, but it became like a dream in Lionel's mind, a lingering memory that he was faintly aware existed, but he couldn't quite grasp. And he also remembered that that harsh sound had echoed while he was in the trial alongside Aina. Could it be a coincidence? The likelihood of that being the case was near zero. So why was all of this important? It all went back to proving the fact this simulation was likely created by humans, and that King couldn't possibly be a spiritual. What was the implication of the Dream Project, created by humans, being infiltrated by spirituals of the true world? What chance would the humans stand? Lionel's expression changed. Was that the truth? Was that the reason the three-finger cult was created? Nov Eluestio. And now that he thought about it, was the demoness human? She should be exactly what her namesake claimed her to be, a demoness, an empress of the demon race. Didn't that make two races now that had infiltrated? Lionel frowned. He couldn't understand why he had muddled such an obvious deduction. Why was it that he was so sure that this man wasn't king when it made perfect sense that he would be? What was wrong with him? He raised a palm to his forehead, pressing it. He felt an aching in his head all of a sudden, and it was making him feel more and more annoyed, agitated even. He was finding it difficult to stay still. He suddenly really wanted to kill something. Little lion? Eleanor's concerned voice echoed. She didn't seem to care about what was happening around in the world at all, as she took care of her son. At some unknown time, even Aina had appeared, ignoring the danger to approach Lionel. "I'm fine," Lionel said much more coldly than he had wanted to. His mother was a bit stunned and her eyes dimmed, but the care on her expression didn't change as she rubbed Lionel's cheek. It felt cold to the touch, but the warmth of her palm seemed to be pouring into him. Aina's expression was especially worried. Lionel seemed to be going through, but she couldn't even begin to understand what it was. The worst part was that she didn't even know how to ask Lionel about it. She wasn't sure if he would even have an answer. In the far-off distance, very few were paying attention to Lionel anymore. And even fewer were paying attention to the small figures of the three-finger cult, namely Lionel. However, Lionel's current gaze was practically spitting fire as he watched Eleanor take care of Lionel. That was his mother. Just as he was about to lose control, the reality around him warping, a hand pressed down on his shoulder. He looked to see Anya wearing that same carefree smile on her face. "Soon," she said in that voice as sweet as honey before looking up. Velasco sent a casual glance upward and yawned. "The Emperor of the Spirituals," he said casually. "Still not enough. Who said you could stand higher than me?" Velasco pressed his raised hand down and suddenly, the lofty spiritual's head distorted. A strong golden force appeared above his head, but it was useless. Bang! In one moment he was in the air, and in the next he was buried deep into the ground. Lionel frowned. The gap between his father and this so-called emperor of the spirituals was indeed large. But he had noticed something immediately. His father had killed all the others with a single strike. But this spiritual... The ground rumbled and an unblemished golden figure slowly walked out from it. Had actually survived. Almost on cue, the skies split again. One after another, existences that could only be said to be the emperors of their kind appeared. Chapter 2155. Published at 14th of September, 2023, 5:45 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 2155. Imperatrice, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel looked forward. He didn't seem to notice the appearance of the other emperors, because his eyes were still on the spiritual's emperor. He slowly stood from the ground. It even looked like he had simply descended all by himself, his legs hardly bending when he hit the ground. He stepped out from the crater, rising into the air once again. The dust that fell around him couldn't seem to reach his body at all. This man was, indeed, the emperor of the spirituals, Emperor Rydran. This wasn't a man who had been seen by his own people in hundreds of years. And yet, oddly enough, he had appeared here, and maybe even more odd than that. Lionel's father had recognized him in a single glance. Was this about Dad the entire time? Lionel thought to himself. These people had begun to attack the human domain immediately. But if that was their goal, why did they wait so long to appear? Why was it that it took Lionel killing so many for this to come to fruition? This might have still been acceptable. After all, maybe they were biding their time and waiting for the right moment to expose their true strength. But then why did none of them pay much attention to Lionel? Someone else might answer that Lionel was too insignificant. But would Lionel think about himself that way? Also, could someone insignificant kill more ancestors in a day than the number that had fallen for centuries? Lionel pinched his forehead harder. He felt like his thoughts were meandering, like he was constantly thinking about worthless, meaningless things. Somehow his mind both felt sharper than it ever had, and slower, as though it was something other than his intelligence that was impeding the flow of his thoughts. Damn it. Lionel's aura fluctuated wildly. He was getting more and more frustrated, but he didn't know where this frustration was coming from. Only Alienor and Aina seemed to realize that there was something wrong with Lionel. Well, there was one other person. A particular white-haired beauty that stood high in the skies with a careful and gentle smile on her face. You are indeed dangerous, Anya thought to herself. She had asked herself a question long ago. If you knew what someone would become, the kind of heartache and carnage they would cause, should you kill them while they were still in their cradle? Would that make you a moral person? Or would that make you more evil than the person you were trying to put a stop to? She still didn't know the answer to that question, but seeing Lionel now, she felt that maybe she wouldn't have to answer it. After all, that dangerous bloodlust would be picked up by her from worlds away. Ho ho, Velasco chuckled. Personally, I would be embarrassed if I were you. But this is still not enough. How about you all stop playing around and get serious? The Emperor of the Nomads, Kiefer. The Empress of the Cloud Race, Venxina. The Emperor of the Spirituals, Rydran. The Emperor of the Beast Domain, Abyss. Even the Emperor of the Rapax was present. Acerix. It seemed that the weight of their little prince's words might be enough to sway the lower reaches of the Rapax, but those at the very top still acted as they pleased. However, Velasco was most definitely correct. This wasn't everything. At that moment in the skies, four-colored bridges appeared, arcing through the air in a fine mist that made them look like rainbows. One was blue, one was green, one was yellow, and the final was red. When these bridges faded away, slowly but surely, four figures appeared. This time, Velasco didn't recognize them at all, but he knew exactly where they had come from. Novel U/S/B. COM blue-haired and blue eyes. Green hair and green eyes. Golden hair and golden eyes. Red hair and red eyes. These could only be one group of people. They were none other than the four great families. The Aderna family in blue robes, the Critus family in green, the Lavis family in gold, and finally, the Brazinger family in red. When they appeared, it was as though they were above the world itself. Lionel's head felt as though it was splitting into two. No matter how hard he tried to use his healing, even resorting to dream sense to split the pain he was experiencing several times, it wouldn't vanish. There was one explanation he could think of, and that was that these symptoms were purely psychosomatic. It didn't matter how many times he split the pain because his brain would always make him feel it to the same level. That woman in red, the one with flaming crimson hair and a pair of ruby eyes that looked like rubies carved from the gems of hell itself. He subconsciously knew her name. Or rather, he subconsciously knew her title. This was a name that Simeon had spoken before while his soul was under Lionel's control. This was the woman who was responsible for the cruelty of Aina's mother's death. Imperatrice Anselma. Chapter 2156. Published at 14th of September, 2023, 5:45 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 2156. Instant. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel had no reason to draw this conclusion, and yet he felt that it was the obvious answer. Nothing that he thought of could shake this belief. The more agitated Lionel became, the more the burning sensation in his kidneys grew, but he didn't even seem to understand until something suddenly clicked. For auras flourished and Lionel's expression changed. Ninth dimension. He didn't know why he knew this. He couldn't even differentiate the strengths of ancestors yet, and could only make vague guesses based on the varied pressures they put on him. But right now he couldn't have been more certain. Those 4 men and women that had appeared, each and every one of them was an existence that surpassed the 8th dimension. However, almost the moment they appeared, that flourishing aura suddenly collided with something. Their faces paled somewhat as foggy chains latched onto their bodies, wrapping around their arms, legs, and necks. Still, they had come prepared. Their skin began to glow with various colored runes, these runes matching the colors of their hair and eyes. When these runes solidified, the constricting effect of the black chains that seemed to have been formed of concentrated anarchic force weakened and slowed, though it did not disappear in the slightest. Not many understood what they were seeing. They simply felt that these 4 were the most powerful 8th-dimensional existences that they had ever seen. They stood on a level all to their own. But as though this wasn't enough, the skies suddenly shook once more. Another bridge appeared, but this time, it was a blinding silver, and more shockingly than that, it wasn't Lionel who understood what was going on first, but it was rather Aina's expression that changed first. That was because she was intimately familiar with this aura. It was the very aura she had sensed after she entered the Silver Empire's zone. The very same aura that was in line with the inheritance she had received. In the skies, a man donning radiant silver armor stood. The armor was constructed of so many pieces that it looked more like an elaborate work of art than anything else. This man's aura was no weaker than the 4 of the great families, but what was different this time was that the chains didn't appear. Lionel's pupils constricted. What did this mean? What was going on? Novlusbco. Inichi had learned from Simeon that the people entering through the Ascension Empire formed the 4 great families were very restricted. Even little Nana, who was only a great genius of the 7th dimension, couldn't use her full strength, let alone these 4. So why was this man fine? The Silver Emperor? Lionel was certain that he should have been from the true world too. So why was he just fine? And wasn't he dead? How was he here? That was when he saw it. The gaze of the Silver Emperor was entirely vacant. It didn't carry any emotion, any light, any life. A puppet? Lionel shuddered. He seemed to catch a glimpse of how others felt when they saw his lineage factor. There was something about that vacant abyss that shook him to his very core. At that moment, Velasco was grinning ear to ear. Good. This is more like it. His black hair fluttered in the air. He seemed to grow to twice his original size despite the fact his body was most definitely the very same. It was like his aura itself simply demanded more space. It had been a very long time since he had faced any sort of challenge. His sights were impossibly far beyond these words. He couldn't even talk about these matters with his wife and son. But this is still not enough, Velasco growled, his irises turning red. If the man who dared to lay a hand my father doesn't appear, I will just kill you one by one until he does. Arrogant. Imperatrice Anselma's sharp voice echoed. Do you believe you would even have the right to stand before me if not for the restrictions of this world? Die. She struck out with a palm. The entire world seemed to lose its color. In the blink of an eye, a formless energy wrapped in a translucent fog appeared before Velasco. Lionel couldn't even track it properly. Even his senses seemed to have been distorted by it. Bang! Velasco's body disappeared beneath the raging torrent of force. Anselma snorted. She wasn't happy to have to come here just for the scum of this world. To have such a lowly being actually speak to her was even more unacceptable. If this matter could end so simply, that would be even better. She felt uncomfortable all over. However, at that moment, the volatile force cleared and Velasco appeared. He seemed unscathed, his robes fluttering in the air, and his gaze as bright as torches. At that moment, his eyes seemed to carry far more of a golden color than bronze. Without a word, he suddenly punched out. He felt that the time for talking was over. Right now, he was nothing more than an enraged son. His fist landed on Anselma's chest before she could react. Her body curved and shot out like a speeding bullet. Velasco took a step forward, ready to pursue, but before he could, a blinding silver light descended. Velasco responded with a punch. The skies split, a vast cavern of darkness taking shape. Velasco and the Silver Emperor stood both close and worlds apart, neither taking even back, the gap between their fists enveloped by a black hole that could shred a solar system to pieces. The emperors and the four great families' experts acted at once, all of them surrounding Velasco. Lionel was suddenly agitated, and he took a step forward. His mother stopped him before he could even move very far, but before she could say anything to comfort him, several auras locked onto them. Too many of the scholars still remained, and aside from them, Anya and Lionel seemed to be focused entirely on Lionel. The situation had flipped on its head. Chapter 2157. Published at 15th of September, 2023, 1:20 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 2157. No. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Anya landed on the ground far more softly than one might expect. As the colors in the sky changed, a battle of proportions far too world-changing and epic to describe began. She didn't seem very affected by it. But at the same time, Lionel seemed to have noticed her at all either. While Anya had been focused on Lionel the entire time, Lionel himself had only faintly noticed her appearance before ignoring her entirely. At this moment, almost all of Lionel's computing power was trying to find a way out of this. His gaze was frighteningly cold, the space before his eyes seeming to freeze a great deal. However, no matter how he racked his brain, nothing seemed to be enough. The scale of the battle above him was far too much. Lionel had thought a lot of times that maybe he would one day run into this sort of situation. But he didn't expect it to actually appear. Maybe he was too arrogant. Maybe it was just a confidence that he had earned. But he had truly believed that there was no situation his mind couldn't get him out of. He had defeated a squad of sixth-dimensional existence in the fifth. He had entered a world where even those on his same level were tens of times more powerful than him, and still came out alive. He had fought demons, been eaten alive. He had just crushed legions of seventh-dimensional geniuses while still in the sixth dimension, and even slaughtered over 50 ancestors, due to his mind alone. He had felt invincible, untouchable, infallible, as though everything in the world could exist on the palm of his hands and be flipped on its head with a thought. It wasn't an arrogance that had come from nowhere. It was a confidence that he had built with his own hands from the ground up. A level of prestige that he deserved. He had accomplished what no other existence could, and just when he was flying high, he had crashed head first into an immovable wall. His eyes were glued to the skies, his teeth set so hard against one another that it felt as though they might crack at any time. His father was entirely surrounded by an existence that wouldn't even need to raise a finger to erase his own existence. Just a single one of their attacks seemed to overturn the world itself, the battlefield entering a state of chaos. Maybe if not for his mother by his side, he would have already been crushed by the battle before him. For the first time, he knew it was useless. There was no path out. There was no sudden plan he could pull out from thin air to claim victory. He felt a sort of helplessness from the depth of his soul, a helplessness that he should have experienced long ago when the metamorphosis just began, but also one that had been delayed to this point. This was a wall that many learned to overcome early on. Anyone who had grand aspirations should have run into such a roadblock in their early years. One might be able to say that it was technically still quite early for Lionel. He wasn't even 26 years old yet. But even in his young age, he had reached a level that others couldn't imagine touching even in their old age. The agitation was bone deep, and the wild fluctuations in his body were only growing. The frigid region before his eyes seemed to have been sparked. Like two rocks banging against one another, the sharp lines of red-gold sparks flew through the air, and yet the temperature only continued to plummet. I really didn't expect you to ignore me on our first meeting in so long, Leo, Anya said lightly. She still wore a smile, barely visible behind that veil she wore everywhere. Though her words seemed to be reprimanding, and even carried a faint touch of a wronged expression, her smile never faded and her voice was as gentle and beautiful as ever. Aina frowned. She was very worried about Lionel's current state, and she didn't want to have to deal with this sort of nonsense. As for Eleanor, her expression was serious. Of course, this wasn't for Anya, nor was it for Lionel. Rather, she was focused on the scholars. That said, the scholars didn't seem to have any intention of attacking. The warning Velasco had left echoed in their ears. It was likely they didn't even dare to attack for fear that the rage of the battle above would turn on them. At that moment, none of them had any illusions about Velasco's weakness. All of those harsh words they had spoken about his cowardice had long since been thrown out. They didn't even dare to breathe too loudly, only silently encircling Eleanor, Aina and Lionel. Lionel didn't even seem to hear Anya's words at all. Mom. Lionel spoke with a somewhat twisted expression. Eleanor frowned, sweeping a glance over this boy before her. Mom. There was only one person in this world that could call her that. She would know better than anyone. Don't you remember me? Lionel asked, his expression becoming more and more agitated. Eleanor looked away from this boy, her expression becoming more and more serious. She could have maybe 2 or 3 of these scholars at once. Maybe if she had more time, she would have a greater chance of dealing with them all. But she was simply too young. She wasn't even 100 years old. Compared to these other ancestors, she hadn't even had time to grow yet. Just when Eleanor was about to make a decision to take Lionel and Aina away, a powerful pressure descended. Eleanor's expression changed. Father. No. It was too late. A pillar of emerald enveloped Eleanor, and even Lionel couldn't react to the sudden change. Lionel seemed to finally wake up, but when his head snapped back, his mother was gone. It wasn't just his mother, but Aina had disappeared as well. He frowned. Father? Emperor Fox. Chapter 2158. Published at 15th of September, 2023, 1:20:09 p.m. Chapter 2158. Relief if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel actually sighed a slight breath of relief when he saw this. In truth, he felt that he had underestimated Emperor Fox even more than he knew. To be able to directly snatch people from the void battlefield as though nothing at all had happened. He couldn't even fathom what kind of strength it would take to do that from Earth. At the same time though, with his mother and Aina safe, he really could breathe a sigh of relief. Even though he still felt completely helpless, he still felt freer to move as he pleased. If only he could grasp onto something, anything, even the faintest hope, he could take action. Bring me back. Eleanor's roar shook Earth itself. The oceans rolled and the Earth split. It looked for a moment as though the supercontinent that the Ascension Empire had so painstakingly put together was about to split into pieces once again. It really would have happened if an emerald energy didn't suddenly heal everything, stitching the very land back together, and filling the skies with beautiful, green northern lights. Emperor Fox sat on his throne calmly, his gaze flickering when he saw his daughter's rage, but he didn't say anything. Aina stumbled back, her ears bleeding due to Eleanor's roar. She had only barely entered the 7th dimension. How could she handle such a thing? Bring me back. Eleanor's roar shook Earth itself. The oceans rolled and the Earth split. It looked for a moment as though the supercontinent that the Ascension Empire had so painstakingly put together was about to split into pieces once again. It really would have happened if an emerald energy didn't suddenly heal everything, stitching the very land back together, and filling the skies with beautiful green northern lights. Emperor Fox sat on his throne calmly, his gaze flickering when he saw his daughter's rage, but he didn't say anything. Aina stumbled back, her ears bleeding due to Eleanor's roar. She had only barely entered the 7th dimension. How could she handle such a thing? Eleanor's expression warped when she saw that her father had no intention of responding. Maybe if he said something, she might be able to convince him. He had always listened to her, doted on her, without exception. But he could also be stubborn about a great many things. And when he got like this, it was impossible to change things. Tears fell from Eleanor's eyes like the rain. Her father never interfered with Velasco, even if it was related to her protection. This showed an implicit sort of belief in Velasco's strength. But the fact that he was doing this now made Eleanor, who had had reason to believe that her husband would pull through like he always did, second-guess herself. Eleanor's head suddenly snapped around. Her expression changed when she saw the state of Aina, and she quickly waved a hand to help her heal. But when she looked again and saw that Lionel wasn't here, her emotions that had been turning from rage to worry reversed once more. The agitation in her heart practically exploded and her chest heaved. "Little lion, where is my little lion?" Eleanor looked toward her father, not roaring again. This time, her gaze was filled with a pleading light. This time, Emperor Fox couldn't quite meet his daughter's eyes. He looked away, gazing off into the distance. "If I brought him here, the fuss he would cause would be much more than yours." Eleanor's expression changed. What kind of nonsense was her father saying? She was in the 8th dimension. Her son was powerful, but he wasn't even in the 7th yet. Was this really just an excuse? Was Emperor Fox tired of Lionel defying him, and had chosen to do this? Father. Father. Father, please, he's my little baby. I'm sorry I wasn't here to introduce him to his family, to help him meet his grandfather, for him to know that he could rely on you. Please forget about any rude things he said. Please bring little lion here too." Eleanor looked as though she would completely lose it. She was only moments from falling to her knees and pleading. She didn't want to believe that her father would do this. Emperor Fox, who had been calm and somewhat awkward from the very beginning, suddenly became enraged. Boom. His palms slammed onto his throne as he stood to his feet. Earth vibrated, pillars of ocean water piercing the skies and tearing holes through the atmosphere. They escaped Earth's orbit as suddenly covered half the planet in a rushing river of raging waters. Eleanor was stunned. Her father was the calmest man she knew. Nothing ever fazed him. He never so much as raised his voice. He was prideful, but it was almost impossible to see it from his exterior. She had never seen him react like this about anything. "Do I seem like a petty man who would do such a thing because of a few words?" Emperor Fox's voice rumbled with a deep tone. The echo made Eleanor feel as though her bones might shatter at any time. The suffocating sort of feeling overwhelming her. "Don't mistake my softness toward you for anything more than what it is. My grandson, my son-in-law, are two men I respect the most in this world. My leaving them on that battlefield is nothing more than a sign of this. Whether they live or die will be decided by the weight of their own spears." Emperor Fox flicked his sleeves and vanished. The vigorousness of his aura only seemed to be increasing by the day. The last time Lionel had seen him, he already looked no different from a middle-aged man, but now he only looked like a man in his 30s. Maybe soon he would look no different from any other young man. Eleanor stood in stunned silence. By her side, Aina's lip trembled, but she remained silent. She hadn't wanted her own words to sway Emperor Fox one way or another. She knew too little about this man. But if even Lionel's mother couldn't do anything, what would her words mean? However, this didn't change how helpless she felt. She fell into her old habits once more, nibbling at her lip. She didn't even realize when she had drawn blood. The pain in her heart was far more than what the pain of her lip could match up to. Maybe if Lionel had been here, he would do what he usually did. Picking her chin up with a finger, he would wipe her blood away with a finger and reprimand her with a smile. "How could you ruin such beautiful lips?" he would say. Aina's tears welled up in her eyes, but she bit her lip harder, refusing to allow them to fall. Chapter 2159. Published at 15th of September, 2023, 1:20:07 p.m. Chapter 2159. 2 favors if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel turned back. His heart couldn't calm, but its beating had slowed somewhat. That roadblock ahead was as tall and thick as it was before. In fact, The more he observed the battle above him, the more he felt that he was still underestimating things. The scholars' eyes narrowed, the apprehension in their hearts increasing. They had no idea how this had happened. How could they just disappear right before their eyes? If there had been some sort of spatial tunnel formed, then they would have been able to take action to cut them off. But how could you move someone such a large distance without spatial force? More oddly, who would have the willingness to save Aina and Eleanor, but not Lionel? What sense did that make? Anya's gaze flickered, seemingly thinking of something. But she didn't say anything about it. It was Lionel instead who seemed to have lost his mind. He roared out, his expression warping. Not only had his mother ignored him, but she had disappeared not long after. He had finally seen her after so long, and yet this was what had happened. His dream force peeled off into countless layers, twisting and warping the space around him. It was truly the stuff of nightmares. Were beasts, monsters, twisting distortions of fear and animosity, all bundled up into a single, towering tapestry of twisting dreams. Anya frowned slightly, her lips parting as though she was preparing to say something. But it was actually Lionel who spoke this time first. "Shut up." Lionel's roar echoed like a clap of thunder. All at once, Lionel's dream force seemed to have been forced back into a bottle. In a flash, Lionel had appeared before him, his fingers shooting out like a spear and ripping Lionel's throat through. Lionel's wrist flickered and his hand wiped off to the side, the motion causing a disk of crimson blood to erupt from Lionel's throat, separating his head and neck. Anya's brows jumped. Their strongest savant had died. Just like that? What? Lionel kicked out, his eyes lit with fury. Lionel's entire body exploded to pieces. He grabbed out at that air. Rise. Lionel's soul was ripped out from his body. Assimilate. Lionel's soul didn't even get a chance to show its loyalty. In fact, he wasn't the only one that was too slow. An odd and mysterious force seemed to rush forward, but it was far too late. Lionel knew exactly what it was. It was that odd force that had appeared after he captured Monkey. The very one that appeared after he took him out and he died right before his eyes. But this time, Lionel was even faster than it. The rush of violent violet aura surged, and Lionel's hair fluttered into the air. He grasped at the skies before him, and the atmosphere changed. Anya's foot tapped the ground and she glided backward, out of reach of Lionel's influence, or so she thought. She looked down and her expression changed. Why was she still standing in the same area? She could have sworn that she had moved back. "I've already returned the favor I owe you. Right now, I think that you should just die," Lionel said coldly. He reached forward at the air right before him. There was still quite some distance separating himself and Anya, and yet her neck magically appeared in his palm. Anya's pupils constricted, but her face was surprisingly calm given the situation. She just hadn't expected this change to be so sudden, and for her life to be in danger so swiftly. But since she had dared to take control of Lionel, why would she be afraid now? Her pupils slowly relaxed and a ring on her finger trembled before Lionel's hand could squeeze. At that moment, a figure appeared to her back. A domain spread out in an instant, and all the dream force that had been at Lionel vanished into thin air. Anya's body was enveloped by a pure white light, and she vanished into motes. Lionel cast an indifferent glance toward the one that had appeared from Anya's ring. It was actually yet another savant, one with the ability to disperse force and nullify ability indexes. Anya appeared by the savant's side, but before she could speak, Lionel pierced forward with 2 fingers. A strong pulse of bow force took shape. Her expression changed, but it was much too late. The savant's head burst like a watermelon, the rain of blood splattering toward Anya who had been by his side. A white light shielded Anya from being spoiled, but the savant was deader than dead. Anya's heart leapt into her throat. She didn't understand what she was seeing. First, the dream force of a savant was directly suppressed. Then, a savant who should have had the ability to nullify all force, ability indexes and lineage factors had suddenly died to force. However, Lionel didn't even take it seriously. When he first met savants, they were existences that he found hard to fathom. But now, he had long since come to know that they were just as fragile as everyone else, if not more so. If not, why were they strategic resources that powerful families could take control of? If they were so invincible, Wouldn't they have a rising power of their own that could exist outside of the shadows? What right did a mere savant have to suppress his sovereign force? Lionel waved a hand. Rise. That mysterious energy appeared again, but Lionel was even faster. Assimilate. This kind of soul soldier would have been far more useful to him as a separate entity, but it couldn't be helped. Lionel knew that if he didn't assimilate these souls instantly, whatever that mysterious energy would, it would step forward and scoop these savants up. Lionel's dream force, which had vanished, appeared once again in full force. By then, Anya had already calmed down. She sighed lightly. How about you return my sister to me, Leo, and accept the guidance of the three-finger cult? It's still possible for you to turn a new leaf. You're following down the wrong path. Not everything in life can be calculated. I've told you that one before. Trying to treat life like it's something that can be weighed on a scale is something only a narcissist would do. You aren't as special as you think you are. Also, I believe you've forgotten. You owe me 2 favors, not just one. Anya spoke lightly, her voice light and gentle. She had told Lionel these things once before, but this time, her words were far more direct and forceful. Lionel truly looked at Anya for the first time. He didn't just look through her, he looked into her. The first favor was returned when I didn't kill your sister. The second favor was returned when I didn't use your sister to find you and take your head. Anya's gaze flickered. How arrogant. She was always with the people of the three-finger cult. Did he think killing her was so easy? Her gaze couldn't help but become colder and colder. Every word Lionel spoke was as though he was looking at an ant, an insignificant figure that would be buried 6 feet deep in the blink of an eye. Now my patience has run out. Chapter 2160. Published at 18th of September, 2023, 1:06 and 33 seconds p.m. Chapter 2160. What right? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's body swayed, and suddenly vanished into a stream of mist. He looked like an image dashed away by rushing waters, floating away and into the wind as though his body had lost all of its form. He didn't even bother to respond to Anya's words. The response she received was a danger sign tingling up the length of her spine. Anya's expression became unprecedentedly serious, a familiar twin pair of horns appearing on her forehead. There was no doubt that this was the Death Pulse deer, the highest lineage factor provided by the silver tablet of the dark side of the Northern Star lineage factors. However, Lionel had already seen it once before. He was entirely unmoved. Bang! A scythe appeared in Anya's hands, barely blocking Lionel's fist. Even so, she took a strong step backward, her wrists trembling. She felt as though her arms might collapse beneath the strain at any moment, but just when she wanted to use force to stabilize herself, it vanished into thin air, Lionel's fist stripping it from her scythe's body. Her body lost control of itself, and she was sent flying back. The expressions of the scholars that had formed a circle froze. Anya was the greatest genius of their three-finger cult. They had never expected for such a thing to happen in just a single exchange. Lionel appeared above Anya, his gaze as cold as an abyssal hell. He didn't seem to see the gorgeous features revealed under her fluttering veil. If he couldn't crush this woman, what right did he have to think about helping his father? He felt that she should just die. Bang! Lionel's fist descended. Anya tried to block again, but it was entirely worthless. Lionel's arm deformed, countless arms growing out from the right side of his body in a truly grotesque sight. But regardless of how impure and gut-turning it was, what it was most definitely was effective. He didn't care about looking pretty, he only cared about destroying this woman before him. Anya's scythe couldn't even begin to block them all. Her body was barraged by a rain of fists, each one more powerful than the last. Her bodice clothing was torn to pieces, her bones breaking and her limbs shattering. Before she even hit the ground, she was beaten to a bloody pulp. Lionel flexed his fists and they vanished one by one until just a single arm was left. Wasting his dream force on creating elaborate, reality-warping phenomena was just a waste of stamina. Since he could bend reality with his dream force now, he would use it in a way that fool Lionel had never considered. He stepped through the void, his body appearing above the beaten and broken Anya. He rose even higher, his fist raising above his head and multiplying to several times its original size. It wasn't just a cosmetic change, but rather a multiplicative effect, one that twisted space and dispersed anarchic force. Die. His fist descended, falling like a meteor from the skies. Sparks of flames flew, a cocoon of wind forming around it as it shot downward. Anya could barely see straight, but in the final moments, her finger barely twitched, two more figures appearing from within her ring. One moved quickly, appearing before Lionel's fist and crossing his arms. Bang! Lionel's arm trembled for a moment before it suddenly exploded. His bones shattered to pieces, his blood and flesh falling like rain from the skies above. The destruction was so devastating that in one moment, his fist seemed to cover the skies, and in the next he was left with nothing more than a shoulder stump overflowing with rivers of crimson blood. Even so, Lionel's gaze didn't shift in the slightest. One might have thought that it wasn't his arm that had just been torn to pieces. The second figure that Anya had manifested pressed her hands together and cast a light over Anya before quickly disappearing. It was clear that she didn't trust herself to remain safe, so after healing Anya, she vanished, not staying behind for even one moment later. Lionel only took note of this as Anya stood. Without any more hesitation, he took out his bow as his arm grew back under a mysterious force. He didn't have the time to waste. He drew his bow and fired. Anya's expression changed, but the arrow she thought was aimed for her suddenly vanished. She sighed a slight breath of relief. To her, Lionel was clearly targeting the defensive savant that had just protected her, but if he thought it was so easy to deal with him, he would be sorely mistaken. This savant was the oldest in her possession, and also the one with the highest survivability if Lionel was ignored. The irony that Lionel had long since died to Lionel's hands didn't settle in until it was far too late. Anya's expression, which had just settled, shook once again as she looked down at her ring in horror. But there was nothing she could do. Crack. The ring on her finger, a protective item that carried her greatest trump cards, cracked and then shattered into pieces. It was then that it dawned on Anya. Lionel's arrow wasn't aimed at her, or the defensive savant. Somehow he had breached the boundaries of reality, peeling back the layer of space that her spatial ring called home, and attacking its structure directly. In that moment, it wasn't just one savant that perished, it was all of them. Anya didn't have time to recover before the defensive savant, standing before her in a protective stance, froze. He stood there for a moment, seemingly at peace before. Bang! His head shattered like a watermelon. This time, in too stunned a state, Anya was splattered from head to toe in blood, her pristine image, already shattered by Lionel's fists, falling even further. Lionel took a step forward, his fist piercing forward. It ripped through Anya's chest as she stood frozen, her body shivering as she looked down at the hole going through her chest. What right do you have to speak to me about morality? What place does trash have to pass judgment on my actions? Chapter 2161. Published at 18th of September, 2023, 1:06 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 2161. Why? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel waved a hand, his gaze sharpening. He could already feel the movement of the scholars. The only reason they had hesitated was because of Velasco. It could be said that Velasco was only ignoring them now because they weren't worth much in the grand scheme, something that was difficult for these ancestors to accept. But that moment of hesitation had actually caused their genius to fall. Despite this, their reactions were odd. Rather than being torn or inconsolable, they were actually worried. This was an emotion that made sense, but the trouble was that it was a bit misplaced, and it didn't seem severe enough given the situation. Anya fell from Lionel's arm. Seemingly feeling that something was odd, Lionel also waved a hand, severing Anya's head from her neck, and then sending two fingers forward, a sharp bow force taking shape and attacking the location of her ethereal glabella directly. With his current dream force, seeing through this only took a small amount of effort. He wouldn't make a mistake like he had with Amory, missing the ethereal glabella after his first attack. However, even after Anya's head shattered, his eyes remained narrowed. The reaction of the scholars was still off. That was when it happened. A blinding pillar of light rose from the starship in the distance. The vessel had been completely ignored by Lionel. It was because it was far too impractical for this battle, and not nearly powerful enough. If he wanted to make a difference with the starships, he would need a whole fleet of them, but he only had one, not even counting the second and larger of the two. In addition, it was better that he did ignore it. After all, his brothers and many of the geniuses of the humans had retreated back to them. Not using the starships could count as keeping them out of the line of fire. However, there was someone else that was on the starship. A woman that Lionel had found practically useless after defeating her. Harmony. Harmony was unable to participate in the air wars because she was only in the 6th dimension, and far too weak. Of course, that was just by the standards of Lionel. Compared to other 6th-dimensional existence, she was even beyond the so-called Cataclysm generation. It was just that Lionel and Aina were on a completely different level. But there was something else that clicked for Lionel in that moment. Back when he was fighting Harmony, there was an odd and sudden boost to her strength that occurred not long after she communicated with Anya. Two sides of the same coin. Lionel's eyes narrowed. From the location where Anya's corpse had collapsed, another pillar of light formed, forcing Lionel back a great deal. The rage in Lionel's heart was only growing. He wanted this matter to be over and done with, but bullshit kept coming. It was like the world was telling him that his power alone wasn't nearly enough, as though it was trying to remind him just how insignificant he was. The more he thought about it, the more furious he was. He clenched his fists, his pores suddenly dilating and beginning to spew out small streams of flames. His body was completely coated, but he didn't seem to have noticed at all, his patience wearing thinner and thinner and thinner. The two pillars of light combined, a shadow of Harmony and a streak composed of Anya's corpse shooting into the skies and melding into one. Their auras began to soar, growing fiercer and fiercer until they reached the very pinnacle of the 7th dimension. But even this didn't feel like it was enough to describe it properly. It was an aura no weaker than an ancestor's despite the level it was stuck out. It felt like Anya. Or maybe it was Harmony. Or maybe both. Could cross the dimensional barrier and battle it out with ancestors whenever she so pleased. Anya stood in the skies, power overflowing. Her horns were twice as large as they had been before. The death force that was under her control spilling over from all sides. Lionel didn't even give her more than a glance, his rage continuing to spill over. Rise! His roar echoed, the corpses of ancestors that had fallen under his father's might, and his own spear beginning to rise out from the ground. However, just when it seemed that he would succeed, Anya cast a glance downward and her death force fell like a torrent. Trying to control death before me? Your arrogance will be your downfall, she said lightly. The connection Lionel had formed was stripped away. It felt like the souls that had just been in the palm of his hands were accelerated on their path to the underworld, not giving them a chance to resurrect at all. Anya looked toward Lionel. Seeing the flames raging out of control around him, she shook her head. Indeed, it seemed that this answer she was going after didn't matter. Clearly, it was already much too late for Lionel. It wasn't a matter of when it would happen anymore, because it already had. He felt that the whole world was beneath his notice, as though he could act with naked abandon and not be expected to care for the consequences. He didn't understand the kind of good work she was trying to do. This world was designed to go down a certain path. Whether it was Lionel's grandfather, his father, or Lionel himself, they all tried to deviate from this path. For the greater good, for the people that called this place home, they had to take a step back, and if they refused to do so, they deserved to die. She raised her hands to the skies, her palms facing upward. Even beneath the carnage of the Battle of Velasco and the four great families, she seemed to have carved out her own piece of the skies. The phantom of a death pulse deer took shape and her aura reached its peak. Her scythe flew up from the ground as she stretched out a hand. Without another word, she slashed downward, aiming for nothing more than to take Lionel's hand. However, she had only just attacked when she froze, looking down at her chest again. Why was there an arm in her again? Chapter 2162. Published at 18th of September, 2023, 1:06 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 2162. Valiance. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel looked Anya in the eyes, his flaming arm burning through her chest. Her mouth opened slightly, but nothing other than a puff of black smoke came out. All of her arrogance, all of her condescension, all of the prim and proper words she had spoken, vanished into the wind along with the ashes of her body. Just because Lionel hadn't used elaborate illusions before, didn't mean he was incapable of it. It just meant that he couldn't be bothered to waste his dream force on her. But since she wanted to continue to push and push, speaking as though she was on the same level as him, above him, even, he chose that there was nothing more to do than to properly put her in her place. Forever. Assimilation worked very specifically. It was best used with souls, but if Lionel wanted to use it on himself, there were restrictions, namely he had to be compatible with what he was assimilating to receive the best possible results. This didn't mean that he couldn't assimilate certain things, but rather that doing so would weaken them a large measure. For example, when he assimilated Lionel, the results were immediate and extremely powerful. But when he assimilated the force-canceling savant, it was much weaker, so much so that he had to be in direct contact with Anya's spear to dispel its strength. These restrictions were far lesser when he used them on actual souls, but he clearly wasn't a soul. He also had a body to filter things through. This was another reason why having a fully separated soul was such an advantage. It gave one the purest chances to be powerful. This aside, the combination of an illusion and Lionel's attack was far too much for Anya to handle. The moment he got into her range, her strength was meaningless. Everything his fist contacted dispelled her force. She didn't even have a chance to protect herself. When he looked toward the scholars this time, their reactions were fierce. This was exactly what he wanted to see. Clearly, they had known that Anya and Harmony were truly just a single person. This was none other than Anya's ability index, an interesting method of cheating death. However, this death right here was the truest death. There was simply no coming back. Rise, Lionel said coldly. Anya's ashes had barely dispersed when they were suddenly ripped out of the air, a powerful torrent of violet force rising as she took shape once again. A valiant soul of a beauty untouched by blemishes appeared, donning a Valkyrie-like armor that seemed to be the only like in the skies. My king, Anya's voice bellowed as she took a knee in the skies, her face filled with reverence. Every ounce of her holier-than-thou attitude had vanished, replaced by an undying loyalty to battle by Lionel's side until she drew her last breath. Lionel reacted coldly, looking down on Anya without a word as his flames flickered around his body. Even so, Anya didn't dare to look up, waiting for Lionel's motion to rise. Lionel, however, had his eyes set on the battle in the skies. Even the scholars didn't seem to be worth his attention. His father stood amidst a tide of enemies, his aura valiant and not weak in the slightest. He hadn't suffered even a single injury, but the armor of the Silver Emperor was beaten and broken. The 4 members of the great families all had blood trickling down the corner of their lips, and the emperors of the various races were in an even sorrier state, many of them missing limbs. Even against so many, he seemed to be in a league of his own, using nothing other than fists to crush all that were in his path. His laughter rang through the skies, his clothes without a single wrinkle, and even his glasses remaining firmly upon his nose as though he was leisurely reading as opposed to fighting a battle to decide the fate of the very human domain. However, this sort of scene only made Lionel feel more agitated. Despite getting beaten back again and again, these people didn't show any signs of retreat. Even the arrogant Imperatrice Anselma had simply fallen into silence, not saying a word. Lionel didn't know where this uncomfortable feeling was coming from. He simply wanted the world to burn to the ground. It was then that it happened. The skies split, a spear appearing for just a moment. The instant it did, it had already begun to collapse. It was clear that the laws of this world didn't allow it to exist, but the residual force that came with it didn't show any signs of slowing, the lag of the regulator unable to keep up with its speed. Velasco looked into the skies instantly, a wild grin on his face. He seemed to have expected this, his body glowing with a radiant bronze light. He grabbed out with one hand, a spear appearing. With the other, a gauntlet formed swiftly. In the blink of an eye, an armor of silver, gold and black took shape. even without the imaging ability of the ancestor Hito. This armor was projected all across the dimensional verse, as though it was a constellation all to its own. The moment before Velasco's helmet took shape and his visor snapped down, whether by coincidence or not, he looked down at his son. A look that Lionel had never seen in his life appearing in that moment. It was a gaze filled with pride, but this pride wasn't for himself like it usually was. Rather, it was a pride in his seed, in his son, his own flesh and blood. It was only an instant, but Velasco knew that Lionel had seen it. "This spear is for my father," Velasco said in a voice filled with unprecedented calm. His aura soared. Lionel's expression changed, his mind working too fast. That aura, it surpassed the 8th dimension. It surpassed the state that the regulator felt was tolerable. Velasco pierced out, the stroke of his blade more beautiful than anything Lionel had ever seen in his life. The descending force was torn to shreds, but Velasco's spear force continued, piercing through the veil of the skies and tearing toward the one that had attacked. A roar of pain echoed. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound demonic. It didn't even sound like it had come from the living. Golden blood flowed from the skies, dyeing reality in a sheen of death. The instant this blade fell, Velasco raised his head and laughed to the skies. One after another, black chains descended, slapping against his armor and cracking it. A second fell, and his armor shattered completely. A third fell and his flesh and bone were nearly torn to pieces. It was then that Lionel understood. His father didn't have the same protections against the regulator that the 4 great families did, and how could he? The 4 great families were the ones that had created this world. His father was meant to be just another one of their pawns, a pawn that had broken free of their control. Until now, when the final chain fell, Velasco's spear shattered as well, but his laughter didn't stop. Coated in blood, covered in chains, he raised his hand with the last of his strength. "Son, watch closely." He gripped his fist, and another spear appeared. Although much weaker than his first, it shone with a radiance no fainter beneath his valiance. Erdiel's note, "Nah bro. Osbeck ain't about to do what I think he's about to do. Nah bro. Nah." Chapter 2163. Published at 18th of September, 2023, 1:06 and 9 seconds p.m. Chapter 2163. Steady blade. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Velasco raised his spear, his gaze red. But it was hard to tell if it was because of his emotions, or if it was because of the blood flowing across every inch of his body, only obstructed by the black chains that layered atop of it. Even so, the tip of his spear was as steady as could be. Maybe one of the first things a new spearman would learn was how to raise and hold their spear. Those that learned fast would learn the importance of a steady blade, one unmoved by fatigue and imbalance. It was the foundation of the fundamentals, both the most basic and the most perfect. It could be said that there were absolutely no flaws in Velasco's form. When he raised his spear, the world itself grew steady as though influenced by his calm. The expressions of the ancestors and 4 great families changed. The Silver Emperor took action first, moving swiftly. His face as placid as ever, he didn't seem to notice the danger that stood before him at all. He couldn't feel the hidden sharpness or the soaring spirit. He moved like a puppet would, emotionless, uninspired, plain and ugly, a contrast so completely against everything Velasco stood for. Velasco took a step forward, his body swaying with weakness, but the tip of his spear just as steady. Velasco's spear and that of the Silver Emperor's clashed, the latter crumbling to ash. It was the simplest of stabs, but it tore a gaping wound in the Silver Emperor's shoulder, shredding apart the dominant arm on his spear. The others, broken and shaken, realized that they couldn't stand idly by. They didn't know what had happened just now, but if things continued like this, there would only be one path remaining for them. Velasco's laughter echoed when he saw them coming. The Silver Emperor was thrown back, a slight tremble of his spear nearly shredding him to pieces. He raised his spear with one hand and fixed his glasses with the other, the blood stain that appeared not seeming to impact his vision in the slightest. He moved with a complete lack of agility, a stumbling sort of inelegance that looked like a poor reenactment of a drunken fist. And yet he swayed out of incoming attacks. His spear thrust forward once again, shredding through the head of the nomad emperor. The latter only trembled once before his head burst to pieces, his body collapsing to the ground below. Vexina of the cloud race crossed her fingers, her cloud figure raising higher and higher into the skies before she suddenly slapped down. Her palms seemed to layer atop of one another across time, fusing one another's afterimages until they suddenly snapped into place and attacked Velasco all at once. Velasco was too slow to react, his body stumbling and broken. He took the full brunt of the attack, but his lips remained in a grin even as more blood seeped through his teeth. He didn't even move, his back straight and tall. It looked as if even the emperors of the various races couldn't touch the hem of his clothing. But Lionel knew that this was simply his father's pride. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction. Even if it meant taking the full brunt of the attack, never being able to take advantage of his flight to disperse some of the strength, he would still take it head-on. He was Velasco Morales. It wouldn't be these people who gained the right to see his weakness. Velasco's spear thrust forward once again, yet another simple thrust. The blade glided through the air in a steady stream, like beautiful flowing water, moving with the grace of laminar flow. It appeared before the Empress' eyes, severing her face in two. Her head burst apart, falling to the ground below. The tail of the Rapax Emperor, Acerix, whipped across at Velasco's waist, its blade shimmering beneath the gold-clouded skies. It looked like he had every intention of shredding Velasco into two. Velasco was once again too late to react. The blade cut into his hip, ripping a path toward his spine and seemingly carrying the momentum to split through to the other side. However, just when it was halfway through, Velasco's body flashed with a bronze light. He once again remained in place, grabbing onto the tail with a steady hand. The expression on his features was one part mocking and another part sinister. He looked down on these so-called emperors from the bottom of his heart, the very depths of his soul. His hand squeezed down and pulled. He ripped the Rapax's tail through his body, pulling the Acerix closer to him, and piercing out with his spear at the same time. The Rapax's sturdy carapace was like wet paper. Every time Velasco attacked, another would fall. Every time he attacked, it would be the simplest of strikes. They didn't even seem to carry any force, but the world itself reacted. It was as though he was doing something he never did. He was explaining. He was simplifying his strength, dulling it down to its very roots, extricating only the most important points and shedding light where there was once only darkness. The Silver Emperor suddenly appeared once again, having finally flown back from the far-off distance he had been stuck in. He closed the distance between Velasco and it in the blink of an eye, punching out with its only good remaining arm with an expression as cold as ice. Velasco was ready this time. The Silver Emperor was the one he paid the most attention to. However, at that moment, Rydran, Emperor of the Spirituals, had raised his hands high into the skies. A strong, surging, metallic-like earth force took shape as countless hiltless blades appeared, each as powerful as the last. With a sway of his hands, they all descended, moving toward Velasco the instant he had attacked the Silver Emperor. Velasco had expected this, though, and circulated his force in that moment, striking out a palm at the same time as his spear descended. However, midway through his palm strike, his force seemed to have caught a snap in his nodal pathways, a mouthful of blood flowing out of his mouth as his aura was disrupted. Chapter 2164. Published at 18th of September, 2023, 1:06 and 9 seconds p.m. Chapter 2164. Sonup, watch closely. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Velasco's grin didn't fade. The Rapax Emperor's blade had severed quite a number of nodal pathways. He could still deal with it when he was only attacking once, exhibiting a level of control others couldn't even begin to fathom. But it seemed that two streams were beyond his limit at the moment. His spear and palm halted for just a moment before they blasted forward again, but the timing was already off. His spear wasn't fast enough to repel the Silver Emperor completely, and his palm wasn't fast enough to disrupt the casting of the Spiritual's Emperor. Rydran couldn't dodge the palm strike, but he had already sent his attack forward. His tattered golden robes fluttered and solidified, bracing for impact. But even so, he was sent flying into the distance with an even greater speed than his attacks had come. The Silver Emperor's head shattered completely under Velasco's spear, but his fist energy was now too close for Velasco to dodge. A hole was blasted through Velasco's chest, causing his body to shudder. His spear tip trembled uncontrollably before his wrist flexed and he stabilized it. His grin subsided somewhat, his mouth parting so that he could gasp for air with what parts remained of his lungs. Right then, the blades of the spiritual's emperor descended, peppering his body through as though it wouldn't leave a single inch unscathed. The four great family experts stood in the far-off distance. Although there was only a line of blood trickling down the corner of their lips, only they knew how truly ravaged their inner organs were. The only reason they only looked somewhat harmed was because their pride didn't allow them to show anything more. Maybe in a superficial sort of way, they were similar to Velasco in that regard. Except for the fact that Velasco would never rely on numbers like this. This is a worthless waste of our time. Those fools died because they're too stupid, the ninth-dimensional expert of the Lavis family said. The moment the regulator's chains fell without protection, he was destined to die. The only difference is whether it'll be in a few seconds or a few minutes. The gazes of the other three flickered, but they didn't speak. They knew that this was true as well. Without the runes they had relied on, it was impossible to survive. Those chains weren't a suppression, they were a death sentence, an execution. The fact that Velasco was still standing at all was enough to shock them into silence. They had been stunned enough that they hadn't even dared to move. But the reason they didn't leave was also due to pride. They wanted to take this man who had humiliated them down with their own hands. Seeing him standing there, his spear tip no longer able to remain steady, a hole in his chest, his gaze lowered and dark, they felt that this was the most perfect opportunity they could ever have. And yet, none of them dared to move. Imperatrice Anselma didn't dare to move either, but she was so agitated the veins bulged across her forehead. She wasn't a patient person, and had never been humiliated like this in her life. How could she take such a thing lying down? Suddenly she remembered something. Her gaze shifted and landed on Lionel, who was standing in a complete daze. His eyes were blank, his body so relaxed it looked like it could collapse at any time. He truly looked as though he was in the greatest state of shock he had ever experienced. Son? Anselma's gaze turned sinister. She raised a palm. Dead man, before you go, take a nice look as your son dies. Anselma had already struck as she spoke. She wanted to see Velasco's despair, but she also didn't dare to stay even a moment longer. She, along with the other three, all activated their own treasures, their bodies already beginning to fade by the time her words had echoed out. Both father and son will die together, what a fairy tale. Anselma's disdainful words echoed through the skies as she finally vanished. Velasco looked up, his gaze bloodshot. This time, it wasn't due to the pouring blood of his body, but rather because he had truly reached the end of his limits. But he had yet to do everything he needed to. There were still far too many scholars still left alive. And now his son was in harm's way. So long as I breathe. Velasco said lightly. There is no one that can stop my spear. Velasco raised his spear once again, the trembling tip becoming as straight as a javelin, as steady as a mountain, as undeniable and eternal as the starry skies themselves. He spoke the words with a steady voice. In his life he had always taken his own path. He had disregarded much of the Morales teachings and built his own. He had ignored the ways of the Void Palace, and set out to see the world at his own pace. He had ventured across the dimensional verse, and unearthed the secret of worlds. His blade was unmatched and his legend unblemished. The only shame was that he had been born in the wrong place. Even when it came to his spear, he had refused to take on his own father's teaching. But it was unironic, in these last moments when he spoke those words, he felt the spirit of his own father. That beautiful sort of harmony of words, a symphony of syllables that caused the world to tremble one final time. So long as I breathe. There is no one that can stop my spear. Velasco thrust out his spear once more, his absolute domain expanding to the point it seemed to encompass the whole of the dimensional verse. Everyone, no matter who they were, felt the boundless vastness of Velasco's heart. It was imprinted into every soul. That unbridled arrogance, the confidence to stand atop of the world and to look down on everything, and most importantly, that fiery, undying will to protect his son. It wasn't just his spear that transferred through space this time, but even his body. His tall back appeared before his son as he thrust his spear one final time. His voice, spoken several minutes ago, echoed through time as well, filling Lionel's ears. Son, watch closely. Chapter 2165. Published at 18th of September, 2023, 1:06 and 8 seconds p.m. Chapter 2165. The weight of a father's love. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Velasco's spear descended, the last of his force piercing through the world. Everything in its path was shredded to pieces. Nothing it touched could remain unscathed. It was a strike that carried the purity of fatherhood, casting light onto the shadows and brightness upon the dark. Even compared to the strike he had used to kill King Velasco knew that this was the greatest spear strike he had ever levied in his life. It was his greatest pride. Anselma's attack never touched even a single hair on Lionel's head. Velasco fell into silence, the last echo of his laughter filling the skies. His spear was steady, his back was straight. But at that moment his pair of glasses, a pair that he had begun to wear the day his son was born, and did until this very day, fell from his nose, clicking as it landed on the ground below. At that moment, the seemingly normal pair of glasses began to flash with images, one after another. Memories that even Lionel could only barely seem to remember began to play through their lenses. He saw his father pick him up with the biggest smile on his face. It was the first time he had seen his son. He had never thought that he would want children in his life, but he had actually found a woman that he truly loved, a woman that he respected, and she had repaid that trust with the most beautiful of little boys. He saw the absolute fury of his father after his innate node was taken away. His father, who never seemed to care about his safety at all, almost destroyed the planet entirely. If not for the pleading of his grandmother, and the state of sickness his mother was in after giving birth to him, having only just barely begun to recover after their trip, the Luxnick's family would have been wiped from the face of the earth at that time. He watched as his father got used to raising a baby on his own. This confident man, unmoved and untouched by everything, couldn't even seem to put a diaper on properly. He read the instructions again and again, looking back and forth between a small, giggling Lionel and the package in his hands, stumped at what to do. He could see the change as he grew older. He saw his father fighting with himself to be sterner, to be stricter. He bundled up his care and affection, storing it away. He bought Lionel his first bike and watched from the side, cross-armed and unmoved as the small Lionel tried and failed to ride it again and again, refusing to lend a helping hand. What Lionel hadn't seen was his father bandaging his wounds in his sleep, carefully cleaning them so that they wouldn't be infected, and changing his bandages so that they wouldn't bleed through. He watched as his father pored over dense texts, how he spent years in the lab, subordinating himself to scientists that he could have killed with the snap of the finger, all for the sake of learning a discipline that didn't exist in the wider dimensional verse. Also that he could fully design the vomit brew Lionel had drank every day for more than a decade of his life. The images flashed faster and faster, seemingly having no intention of stopping. And when they got to the end, they looped again and then again, and then again, on constant repeat. Even after such a battle, they didn't have even the slightest crack on them. It was impossible to tell just how much effort Velasco had put into crafting them. These glasses were something that Velasco had created so that Eleanor could watch Lionel grow up. Stuck in the Void Palace, there was no other way for her to experience her son's growth than to do this. At least this was what Velasco had told Lionel. But there was an obvious flaw in his story. Lionel's mother had long since left the Void Palace, and Velasco had long since left Lionel's side. So, why did he still wear the glasses that he clearly didn't need? Velasco's back was all Lionel could see. The vastness of the world around him seemed so minuscule in the face of his father's figure, completely meaningless and without the slightest sense of importance. "Dad," Lionel called out, his dazed gaze seemingly having regained some of its focus. He called out to his father, hoping that he would answer, hoping that he would turn around, hoping that it was another one of his practical jokes. Another voicemail prank. That was definitely what it was. He just decided to up the ante a little bit, because he was getting too good at seeing through them. That must be it. Dad. It's not funny, the joke is played out. Old man. Lionel reached forward and touched his father's back, pushing forward. His dad didn't budge even an inch. Strong and steady, an ancient mountain unmoved by wear and tear. But when Lionel touched his father, he felt like a jolt had been sent through his body. He looked down at his palm, a thick, sticky liquid dripping down it. It felt as though he had dunked his hand into a bucket of red paint. He couldn't even see a single inch of his own skin. There was just blood and more blood, endless and continuously flowing without pause. Old man, I swear to God, if you don't turn around right now, I'll never talk to you again. Lionel had never been so enraged in his life. He had never reacted to his father's pranks like this. Even after he made fun of him after his and Anna's breakthrough, he had at most smiled bitterly. But right now he was truly enraged. This was too far, much too far. He grabbed his father's shoulder and pulled hard, but he still didn't move. Lionel spun around his father's body, his expression livid, but his lip trembling uncontrollably. It was then he saw it. That indifferent smile. Those pride-filled eyes. That spear as steady and calm as the surface of a lifeless lake. There was nothing else. There was no breath. No light. Lionel's world crumbled. His tears fell, his gaze turning entirely crimson. A banshee-like screech echoed across the dimensional verse. The void battlefield shattering into countless asteroid-sized pieces of rock. Erdél's note size. Chapter 2166. Published at 18th of September, 2023, 1:06 and 7 seconds p.m. Chapter 2166. Die. 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 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's roar was akin to nothing that had ever been heard before. The pain and devastation were undeniable, but it was more than just that. It was a fury toward everything. A fury that burned within the deepest reaches of his very being. A fury that wanted to destroy everything in his path. A violent wave of dream force spread out in all directions. It was a wave the likes of which should have only been able to be produced by a universe. A wave so large and all-encompassing that it was entirely inescapable. That was the most shocking part of it all. The void battlefield wasn't destroyed under some mysterious strength, nor was it some physical force. It was destroyed for no other reason than Lionel's will descending down, wanting to see everything in his path destroyed to the greatest degree. The void palace crumbled to the ground. The surrounding solar systems and galaxies quaked. Even the anarchic force before Lionel, the arbitrator of destruction, the force of the strongest beast of devastation to ever exist, crumbled to ashes. Lionel's twin pair of Scarlet Star Force innate nodes erupted with a blinding light, tearing a pair of holes through Lionel's body and forming two burning flames on either side of his hip. Cracks began to appear in his skin, jagged and grotesque, and colored in red and gold. It looked as though a virus was taking root in his body, but Lionel himself only seemed to continue to roar into the air. At that moment, within the deepest depths of his mind, a figure sunken into a lake of blood was collapsed face first within without even the smallest sign of movement. The chains that had bound him had already long since shattered, but this didn't seem to have been enough to stir him awake. Right then, though, his finger twitched. The dream force erupting from Lionel doubled. The figure stirred once again. The dream force erupting from Lionel doubled once more. It was impossible to measure just how large the difference was getting. Lionel had already somehow awakened his dream force to a level that surpassed a savant despite not being a savant himself. But now, it seemed to be that he was pushing even further beyond those bounds, his limits impossible to see. The stronger his dream force grew, the more violent the destruction around him became. Even the scholars were forced to rapidly retreat, the shock on their faces evident. They hadn't moved initially just to make certain that Velasco was dead, but the moment they had the intention to do so, it looked as though Lionel had completely lost his mind. They looked down at the battlefield before them, their minds shaken. The void battlefield was the strongest land in all of existence. It withstood the wear and tear of anarchic force for countless years. While it was possible for them as ancestors to cause sweeping damages to it, that was still greatly limited by both breadth and depth. However, right this moment, They could see through to the end of the void battlefield entirely. Lionel hadn't just shattered a top layer. He had shattered the entire thing. Lionel's body continued to warp and change. The more the figure stirred, the more furious his roar became. The images projected to the rest of the human domain simply couldn't hold up. They only had time to see Lionel's head tilt up into the skies, and for a howl the likes of which they had never experienced before to suddenly bellow forth, before the images crumbled completely. Their only conclusion was that this destruction had to do something with Lionel, but they had no way to confirm this, and their greater logic told them that this simply didn't make any sense at all. Lionel, however, wasn't in a state to care about the thoughts and feelings of others. The more the figure in the pool of blood stirred, the more violent his thoughts became. His body grew a size, and then another, until he was eventually over 3 meters tall. Horns that seemed as red as blood in one light, and as dark as night in another, grew from his forehead, piercing toward the skies above. His skin, cracked by violent streaks of scarlet star force that looked like the tracks of molten rock, began to be covered in scales of alternating red and violet. If it wasn't for the fury on his face, it might even be possible to say that he was a truly beautiful creature. Every line of his scales was clearly defined, carved of the most gorgeous of gems, and carrying the reflection of the world within. The pulsing veins of scarlet star force that flew through them only made them look more exotic, and accentuated their beauty all the more. His hair had grown into a flowing river of twinkling violet-red light, seeming to have neither shape nor form. It looked as though he had stepped out from a dream. But Lionel didn't want beauty. He wanted death. He wanted destruction. Lionel's body vanished, his howl lingering in the air without the slightest hint of disappearing. The scholars felt their hearts jump into their throat, but it was already much too late. They didn't even realize when Lionel had appeared before them. It was as though he had always been there, as though he had twisted reality to make it so. He didn't need to move. He just needed to change reality into what he saw fit, and it would be. His claw swung out in a slapping motion, and caught the jaw of a scholar that tried to dodge. The strength behind his swipe was so fierce and all-pervading that the scholar's head twisted on his neck, not stopping until it had completed 3 revolutions. By the time he had fallen to the ground, dead, Lionel had already appeared before 4 more scholars, killing them all as though he was shredding trash apart. Die, die, die. For every word he spoke, yet another planet in the far-off distance would crumble to ashes. Chapter 2167. Published at 18th of September, 2023, 1:06:05 p.m. Chapter 2167. Cease to be if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 2167. Cease to be. Lionel's howls descended onto the whole of the dimensional verse. Those that were lucky enough to not be destroyed took cover, dodging out of the way of shattering glass windows and collapsing buildings. But the one thing they couldn't escape from was that sound, that howl that would haunt their dreams for decades to come, and even worse than that, the events that would happen afterward. The blood of scholars dripped from Lionel's fingers. His mouth had long since closed, but his howls continued to sustain. It was clear that these roars came not from his voice, but his very soul, an entrenched and impossibly deep pain that resonated through his very being. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. There hadn't been enough death, not enough destruction. He needed more. He wanted more. He wanted to feel more blood drip between his fingers, more bones cracking beneath his claws, more cries of despair to drown out his own. He flashed and vanished, his steps moving impossibly quickly, and yet not at all. Reality warped around his being, and every movement he made was like another step on the hearts of those that were sitting and waiting to see just who he would target. The cloud domain was in shambles. The existence of an emperor to their race was like a pillar that held up the skies. It was impossible that they wouldn't know about her death immediately, especially since they were so skilled in matters of the mind and soul. They were in a state of both chaos and mourning when Lionel's howls reached them. The broadcast to the human domain had not been sent to them, so they had no idea about what had happened. Only the highest echelons understood the mission their empress had been on, and they had known the risks. But seeing the price they had to pay made it extremely tough to swallow. Now they had the responsibility to calm down the masses. What they didn't know is that they might never get the chance to. Lionel hadn't chosen the cloud race out of malice, he simply chose the closest domain he could. There was a reason the cloud race had been able to infiltrate them so deeply. He cared about nothing other than making the world suffer. He walked through the starry skies, walking across impossible distances. Every planet he walked by, whether inhabited or not, crumbled to ash. It took nothing more than a ripple of dream force, and everything else followed naturally. He moved even faster than a starship could fathom. The news of the death and destruction spread fast, but not faster than his steps. Oftentimes the news would come long after the planet had already shattered to pieces. The death count was already quickly approaching the hundreds of billions, and then began to push the trillions. These lower-level planets simply didn't stand a chance against him, and the barriers that protected lower-level worlds from higher-level existences entering them seemed to be entirely useless against Lionel. He crossed into fourth-dimensional worlds, fifth-dimensional, crossed that and entered seventh-dimensional worlds before going back down to sixth, seamlessly and without issue. The world was his to command. The eighth-dimensional world of the cloud race quickly got word of what was happening, their expressions warping violently. They didn't know about Lionel. They only believed that Velasco had survived and was now seeking revenge. However, the who didn't particularly matter. Their race was taking devastating losses every minute that this continued. They had to do something. But their preparation didn't mean a single thing. Lionel appeared in the skies above their capital, his howls growing so loud that many died just from the sound itself. It discriminated against no one, laying waste to everything in its path. Many died with their ears and eyes bleeding, their internal organs shattered to pieces. Dozens of ancestors began to appear in the skies one after another, many more rushing in from other worlds in order to close in on the gap. Lionel raised his hand. His scarlet star flames roared out of control. He was enveloped in a ball of fire that expanded wildly. It surged out in all directions as the fine seals on his second Scarlet Force innate node completely shattered, forming two enormous ninth-dimensional innate nodes in each one of his kidneys. He didn't even need to face the members of the cloud race. He fell like a meteor, crashing through their planet, and straight to the core of their world. His flames erupted like a roaring tempest, taking over the magma veins of their world, and causing all of their volcanoes to erupt all at once. The ancestors rushed after Lionel, but an eighth-dimensional world wasn't something that even they as ancestors could ignore. Lionel using their natural phenomena to attack them was like killing two birds with one stone, destroying their most important world and killing their most valuable citizens all at the same time. The eyes of the cloud race ancestors went red, but they didn't realize that this wasn't Lionel sparing them, nor was it him avoiding them because he couldn't face them. They were too used to being infallible, they didn't realize just how much danger they were in. Until it was too late. They weren't able to react at all when it happened. All they saw was a sea of red. And then the life that they had been so proud of was entirely snuffed out. Lionel's shadow appeared within a surging geyser of magma. His fist was raised into the air, but it was already on its way back to his hip as his second pierced forward. The speed of his punches felt both slow and somehow impossibly fast at the same time. Every time he punched, another flare of red gold would form, burning the bodies of the surrounding ancestors to ash. He punched again and again. Even after they had all died, he was entirely relentless, his furious howls echoing through the skies. That day, the cloud race of the dimensional verse ceased to be as it was once known. Chapter 2168. Published at 18th of September, 2023, 1:06 and 4 seconds p.m. Chapter 2168. Two Suns. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 2168 Two Suns. The shock of this matter wouldn't truly settle in until much later. It was simply far too unfathomable. And worse than that, it was almost impossible for news to spread from domain to domain. While the cloud race had infiltrated the humans, this was a very rare instance of taking advantage of a very unique talent. However, there was one matter that couldn't be hidden. A matter so shocking that it wasn't a mere simulation that would be astonished, but rather the entirety of the Cataclysm Zone. Or more accurately, The vast bubble. The location was deep within the vast bubble, a region where only powerhouses could hope to step foot. The deeper one was, the more powerful the demonic attacks one would face would be. These sorts of places were rife with resources, but there was only a collection of a very few that would dare to step into this territory. This place was one where the four great families thrived: the Brazinger family, the Lavis family, the Aderna family, and the Crutus family. Soon after vanishing, it was this location that Imperatrice Anselma and the others returned to. This was the place they called home. But what they didn't expect was that the phenomena of golden blood filling the skies that had taken hold of the human domain and the void battlefield would be even more exaggerated in this location. So much so that even they, who were quickly replenishing their strength as ninth-dimensional existences, suddenly felt far too suffocated to breathe. Their expressions changed one after another because they knew exactly what this sort of thing meant, but they couldn't bring themselves to believe it. It was unfathomable to them, something that they were entirely unwilling to accept. It was a true death. When one entered the ninth dimension, they would practically become infallible to all others except other ninth-dimensional existence. But even then, a ninth-dimensional existence was extremely difficult to kill, so much so that they had to be classified in terms of false deaths and true deaths. A ninth-dimensional existence was more than just their being, they were also the sum of their comprehension. Given enough time, it was possible for a ninth-dimensional existence to regain their life slowly, even though their consciousness was indeed dead, or rather, in this case dormant. This would be considered a false death. But when that line was crossed and there was no return at all, it would become a true death. A death whereupon there would be no coming back, no slow retrieval process, no chance at survival. When this happened, all the sum of what a ninth-dimensional expert had been would be released back to the universe. The strength of such an existence was truly unfathomable, especially when they reached a certain level that allowed them to look down upon even most other ninth-dimensional existences. There should have been only two ways to kill an existence like this and force them into a true death, and both of those ways should have only been related to a single existence. A regulator. Either such an existence had to offend a regulator in some way, or they had to be attacked by a person who could circumvent or supersede the rules of a regulator. But such existence were either legend or acting in small bubble worlds. In reality, the death of such an existence was a great boon. It would give many others a chance to rise. But to the four great families that wanted to be in control of everything, this was the worst-case scenario. And for more reasons than just this. A supreme of the human race had just died, and not long ago. The final seal on the barrier had shattered. The vast bubble was on its deathbed. They all paled at once, because they also came to another realization. The person that had died. There couldn't be such a coincidence in this world. There was no doubt that this person was King, the strongest expert of the vast bubble, an existence unfathomable to them, and the only reason they would lower themselves to enter that small world. The creator of the Dream Project, the man who loomed in the shadows of the Dream Pavilion, a bestower of abilities, a man even called God by others, had died to the single spear of such an insignificant existence. They had seen the spear strike. They had seen the blood. They had heard the cry of pain and unwillingness. However, the legend of this man was so firmly imprinted into their hearts that they never once considered the idea that he might die. At the very worst, an extremity of his was injured and he had roared out in humiliation. But dead? Their bodies shivered from head to toe. Such a man was killed by a single spear stroke, one stroke of the blade, a single chance in an infinitesimally small window of opportunity. All at the hands of a man who had been forced to suppress himself at the eighth dimension, and only suddenly broke through in that one brief instant. How was this possible? No, the answer to this question didn't even matter. What would they do now? How would they respond to this situation? The demons were already coming. Demons that they couldn't even fathom defeating. The so-called rankings that they had formed were nothing more than a political plow to trick the smaller families of the vast bubble, to believe them to be infallible, the only existences at the very top. It was what the great families were best at, manipulating public opinion and pulling everyone along on puppet strings. But now the real demons were coming, the truest of the demons, the most powerful of them. and the one man that should have been their frontier of hope had died. To a single spear. The plight of the vast bubble took a shuddering pause as they came to a realization. Velasco had never cared about them. They were entirely insignificant in his eyes. He had only wanted one thing: revenge against the man that had killed his family. At that moment, a howl filled with grief and indignation echoed through their reality, and they shivered from head to toe. The first son they had enraged had killed their greatest expert. And now his son after him, even though they didn't quite realize it now, would become an even worse nightmare than the first. Chapter 2169. Published at 19th of September, 2023, 12:49 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 2169. Possible? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Blood dripped from Lionel's claws. A sea of beasts stood before him, but there was a single one that wasn't prostrated to the ground, quaking in fear. Beasts always had a higher sensitivity to certain things. With their intelligence being lower on average, they relied almost entirely on instinct to reach the level they had. But that was also their downfall. While they were more instinctual and thus speedier in improvement, they, who should have been maybe the greatest challenge to Lionel, couldn't even raise their heads. They bowed them low to the ground, not even looking up as their hearts were ripped from their chests, as their heads were severed from their necks, as their blood was forced to run in reverse and their inner organs ruptured within their bodies. Every step Lionel took, millions would die. By the time he had walked through to the end of the beast domain, he had no idea how many he had killed, nor did he care. But his steps showed no signs of stopping, entering the nomad race domain with those very same slow and yet impossible fast steps. It was as though nothing in this world could stop him from massacring all that there was. The nomad race, being the third furthest away, had already felt that something was wrong. After their emperor had fallen, they had been alerted as well, and were quickly trying to deal with and handle the situation. When the howls began, their entire population was shaken, and it made it much harder to control the situation. How could the common nomad not believe that the end of the world was coming? First their emperor had died, and now they were facing an unknown enemy whose enraged howls made their blood curdle. They sent out scouts to gain an understanding of the situation, but without fail, each and every single one of them died, whether it was a mere seventh-dimensional existence, or a monstrous existence of the eighth dimension. It was all the same. It was then they understood just the level of danger they were in. Rather than being caught off guard like the cloud race had been, they hurried to evacuate. They didn't have full information on what had happened, but the snippets that they had caught from the messages sent back by their people was more than enough for them to understand just the kind of monster they were facing. The faces of those of the upper echelon warped. Not all of them had been on board with the actions of their emperor, but he was too much stronger than them. Usually when he made a decision, they could only nod along. None of them had thought that such a decision would put their race on the brink of annihilation. But that was the harsh reality facing them all. Gregwin, that is enough nonsense. I told you to go, so go. Gregwin, the little prince of the nomad race, was speechless. He had never been reprimanded like this in his life. He was usually quite a laid-back person, and hadn't done much even during the domain war, but he was a genius for a reason. When he saw his race losing in such humiliating fashion, the first thing he had wanted to do was go out to seek revenge. But before he could do that, he was sent back here. And then, before he could even get over the first humiliation, their entire race was evacuating? To where exactly? This was their home, their domain. What the hell was this? Unfortunately, he didn't get a chance to say anything more. With a wave of the ancestors' hands, he was sent away with the others. As for where, even Gregwin wasn't aware. Not long after he disappeared, the ancestor stood in the skies with those that had chosen to remain. It was simply impossible to evacuate everyone. They knew quite well that their people were still being massacred. Those from 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th dimensional worlds simply didn't stand a chance even if they had chosen to evacuate. This sort of humiliation wasn't something that they could forget even given an entire lifetime. As such, they had chosen to remain behind. Whether to appease the rage in their own hearts, or for the sake of hoping that their deaths would appease the monster that was coming for them. Both seemed like viable reasons for these old men and women to hold their heads high. And then they saw it. They didn't know what they had expected. They had thought of the legend of void beasts and thought that maybe one had gone on a rampage. They had also considered Velasco, thinking that the failure of their emperor was tied to his success and willingness for revenge. What they hadn't expected was for the creature before them to be so beautiful, so utterly mesmerizing. If it wasn't for the blood that ran from its claws, they would have felt like they were in a wonderful dream, one they didn't want to extricate themselves from. However, this wasn't a dream. It was nothing more than a nightmare. The ancestor that had sent Gregwin away didn't even have time to blink once before he found 5 bloodly claws running through his chest, pinching down and ripping out his ribcage, lung and heart. He collapsed to the ground, his consciousness fading. He could only barely listen to the horrible screams of the men and women he had been by the side of for countless centuries. He could distinctly remember each one of their faces with each one of the cries he heard, his chest pulsing even without his heart. That sort of pain went beyond just a physical organ. But then he heard that howl once again. It seemed to fade back into his consciousness, and he wondered if his own pain could match up. Their emperor had gotten involved in something he never should have, and it seemed that their race would have to pay the price for it. The eyes of the ancestor flashed with unwillingness. This sort of monster, could their descendants hide from him? Was that even possible? Descent through the realms. Chapter 2170. Published at 19th of September, 2023, 12:49 and 26 seconds p.m. Chapter 2170. Rational. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel dropped the final skull from his hands. It looked so small in his palms, so insignificant. His head tilted up to the air. The white of his eyes had become entirely violet. His irises a deathly sheen of crimson. His face looked just as demonic as the rest of his body. His vision sharper than it had ever been. The ancestor was right to worry. It only took a moment and a single glance for Lionel to see through what he wanted to see through. He took a step forward, ready to pursue them, but before he could, his raised foot stopped, slowly lowering back to the ground. Before him, a man wearing valiant golden armor had appeared. That stalwart face, that determined expression, that complex look, there was only one person it could be. It was none other than Lionel's Uncle Montez. Lionel didn't say anything, he simply looked at the man. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, time wasn't an issue. He had all the time in the world to send everyone in this dimensional verse to hell. He didn't need to use much effort to find them again, and then again. There was no one that could hide from him, nothing. It seems you haven't lost your rationality, Montez said lightly, realizing that his nephew had no intention of speaking to him first. He didn't blame him. He had done nothing as his own elder brother died, but there was truly nothing he could have done. He wasn't as good as Velasco, he wasn't as strong, he was always chasing after his elder brother's footsteps, and yet continuously only able to watch him get further and further away. Lionel had seen that frustration on his Uncle Montez's face before. It happened the day he taught him his grandfather's way of the spear. He had tried to paint a spear, and it had looked beyond perfect in Lionel's eyes. But after he had finished, drained and sweating, Montez shredded it to pieces, enraged by the result. Back then, Lionel could tell that if not for the fact his nephew was right before him, Montez's reaction would have been one of even greater frustration. Not long after that, Montez had left Lionel to his own devices, going off to who knows where, and now he had suddenly appeared before Lionel once again. Imperfectly rational, Lionel spoke slowly. His voice carried an edge of biting cold to it that didn't quite seem to be human. But just hearing it made Montez completely shocked. He had truly thought that Lionel had completely lost his mind. Even the echo of the howl still reverberated in his ears. Just to stand so close to Lionel, over 50% of his force was used to protect his orifices, so that he didn't vibrate to death. But this made the reality worse than he had originally thought. He thought that maybe he could try to risk his life to wake Lionel up, or maybe help him to awaken enough rationality to stop this madness. But reality was very much different. Suddenly he understood. The closest domain to Lionel hadn't been the cloud race at all. In reality, it was the human domain. If he had lost his mind, why would he go to the cloud race first and now the human domain? If all he wanted to do was kill indiscriminately, what point would there have been in going so far away? He had never lost his mind at all. He wanted to kill. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he didn't care much about the innocence of those that fell beneath his blade. Lionel, you're killing women and children. So what? Lionel asked. Montez didn't know what to say. He had never been good with words. Someone like Lionel was already far beyond him in this regard. The only saving grace was that it seemed that Lionel didn't have any intention of killing him, but even that was still up in the air. Someone so cold, so distant, so unfeeling, seemed to be the kind of person that could do anything. Why not just target those responsible? I've heard about what you've done in the past before. I know the kind of young man you are. You gave up the chance of having 2 ability indexes all for the same, because you saw the humanity in the child of another race. What you're doing now is not like you. Wrong. I didn't kill that child because the ability was worthless to me. I had no need for it. It served me no purpose, no function. The trash of the Void Palace would never be able to match up to me regardless. And it was more worth it to gain a favor from the Rapax than it was to obtain something I didn't need. Montez was shocked by these words. Looking into Lionel's eyes, he didn't know how much of it was true and how much of it was nonsense. But what struck him was that Lionel didn't seem like the type that would lie in this sort of circumstance. What would be the purpose? Montez shook his head, gritting his teeth. He was on his back foot. He was very much used to interacting with Lionel as the one in the superior position, but now he could hardly tell who was the uncle and who was the nephew. He almost felt that Lionel had simply casually allowed him to take the lead in the past, because he felt that it was what most others would do. Just how much of his nephew's personality was real, and how much of it was manufactured for the sake of appeasing those around him? How much of his charisma was real versus fake? How many of his actions were just calculated chess moves to make those around him feel the way he wanted them to? Montez didn't know what to do or say, his flustered appearance only growing as Lionel raised his foot once more to leave. Suddenly his mouth opened. Aina is pregnant. Chapter 2171. Published at 19th of September, 2023, 12:50 and 40 seconds p.m. Chapter 2171. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2171. Your son in a deep crevice of the shattered void battlefield. A man laid beaten and broken. He continuously coughed up blood, but he found it very difficult even to move a single inch, let alone escape from this place. He had fallen into a fold of reality, albeit on purpose. He knew that his only chance at surviving was to do this. The regions between domains were quite volatile, and with the destruction of the void battlefield, the only real stabilizing force, it became even worse. These so-called folds of reality weren't just pockets of space, or else there was exactly zero chance that Lionel would have missed a chance to kill this man. That was because this man was none other than the emperor of the spirituals race, Rydran. It had to be remembered that folds of reality were the substance used to protect lower-level worlds, and they were also what were used to keep third-dimensional, and yet to mature worlds away from the devastation of the wider dimensional verse. In doing so, the dimensional verse was able to keep things organized and separated, and the regulator was able to maintain its control. This wasn't a normal fold of reality. It was one found in the void battlefield. It was stronger than most, and it was highly layered. Rydran had allowed himself to fall through 3, nestled within one another. Maybe if Lionel had been specifically looking for him, he would have found him. But Lionel's opinion of his father was far too high. In his mind, Rydran could only be dead. Of course, Lionel had been thinking too much. Velasco had been heavily injured, and he had also only attacked with a single palm strike. In addition, Rydran was most proficient in defense as he was a metal-type spiritual. If Velasco had used his spear, there would have only been one result, but he had to use it on the puppet of the Silver Emperor at the time. Rydran shook his head. He knew he stood no chance to get out on his own, and this kind of injury wasn't something that he could deal with easily. Usually he would just cast this body away and rebuild a new one. Of course, such a thing would take a ridiculous amount of resources, but he was an emperor. Even if he didn't want to waste the resources, his people would never allow him to give up on himself like that. The issue was that Velasco was truly sinister. Something about that palm strike had not only heavily injured him, it had likewise heavily injured his soul, while simultaneously binding him to this body. Right now he was like any other human. If his body died now, he would die. He had no choice but to call for help. Rydran had no idea how long passed. It was impossible to tell the length of time while stuck in a fold of reality, but eventually a spiritual did come. When he saw who it was, he couldn't help but relax. It was his pride and joy, the best of his children. A young man stepped into the fold of reality, his body protected by a mysterious flickering chain around his neck. His expression changed when he saw the state of his father, but he didn't say much as he came forward, helping him up slowly. If Lionel had been here, he would have recognized this young man with incredible ease. It was none other than the very same young man he had seen projected from the Bow Domain Tower. It was only right for the young man to be shocked. He hadn't expected that his father could ever end up in such a state. Let's return, Rangel. Are you going to be all right, father? Yes, I just need Rydran froze. He looked down at his chest, only to find that an arm had gone through it. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He hadn't thought much about who he asked to come back. He trusted everyone in his race. His position had always been unshakable. Although it was a bit weird that his son would come of all people, he didn't think twice about it. That was because even if he trusted everyone, how could he trust anyone more than his own flesh and blood? But of all the outcomes, he had never expected this one. I don't know why you felt the need to lie to me, father, Rangel said lightly. I can see through your state with a glance. Your soul has been fused to your body. You'll be a cripple for the rest of your life. You've served the spirituals for long enough. It's time for you to rest. Rydran's consciousness began to quickly fade. Didn't try to lie to you, I only wanted. Rydran collapses dead. He only wanted to tell his son that he hadn't tried to lie to him. He had just wanted to continue his front as a powerful father, unflappable and unmovable. But he didn't know that that image had already crumbled the instant Rangel had seen his state. Rydran looked down at his father's corpse. There was truly no better opportunity than this. It was as though a pie had fallen from the skies. He looked away and at the object in his hands. With a flick of his finger, the flesh and blood vanished, leaving behind nothing but a gorgeous, golden innate node. Rangel was the very same legendary genius that Wise Star Order had spoken about, the boy born with not just one, but 9 innate nodes. What others didn't know was that Rangel wasn't satisfied with this. That was because he was just a single innate node away from accomplishing something that would flip this world on its head. Not only did he need a 10th, but he needed this very innate node in his hand. If he could have taken it from someone else, he would have. The trouble was that even though innate nodes were less rare amongst spirituals, that was only for the base and lower elements. This variant Earth-type innate node was special, and had only appeared once in their history, and now it was his. Don't worry, father. The fact that you ended up in this state could only mean that your potential wasn't enough to stand atop of this world. If you can't even conquer this world, then how insignificant would you be in the next? Your son will carry on this burden for you. Chapter 2172. Published at 19th of September, 2023, 12:50 and 40 seconds p.m. Chapter 2172. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2172. Better lie? Lionel lowered his leg once again and looked toward his uncle. He didn't say anything for a long while, and neither did Montez. It was completely silent, the scent of blood raising through the air as the countless corpses continued to bleed out. I can give you another chance to come up with a better lie, Lionel said lightly. Montez's lip twitched, but he didn't know what to say. He knew nothing about Aina's ability. In fact, the last time he had seen Aina was the last time he had seen Lionel. He had never actually been to Earth before, and when he first met Lionel, it had been nothing more than a projection. As such, When would he have even had a chance to see Aina recently at all, let alone know before Lionel that she was pregnant? Montez had been around the battlefield when everything happened. He felt that Velasco was too arrogant even to the point of disrespecting their own father, by refusing to take on his legacy, when he was clearly so much better suited for it than Montez himself. But how could Montez not understand the inner turmoil within Velasco? There was a point in the latter's life where he didn't care about anything other than gaining his father's approval. The truth was that despite the love that Montez and Velasco had for their own father, he hadn't been the best parent. The loss of their mother had led Ishmael down a road that seemed to have no reward at all. And though he never directly took it out on his two boys, he drifted away and apart from them until the day they received news of their death. Montez and Velasco reacted very differently to this news. Back then, Montez had only been in the sixth dimension. His progress was so much more similar to the Cataclysm generation than it was to his genius of an elder brother. He couldn't do anything but lash out and rage within the confines of his own home. Velasco, however, had strength, true strength. He left without saying a word and began to rampage, shedding blood all across the human domain. It was much different than what Lionel was doing now, but the difference was that Velasco had grown up within a power clan. He understood the inner workings and politics much more intimately than Lionel did. As such, he was far more interested in making those traitorous bastards die. The reality was that the only reason the Void Palace had survived to this point was because Velasco had already killed all those he had evidence for. He had gathered much more evidence in recent years, but he never took action because he had a bigger target in mind, the real mastermind, the man who called himself king. That event and the things that occurred afterward caused Montez to build up a lot of resentment. He felt that he was too useless, too small and insignificant in the face of his brother. He felt that as a son he should have had a part in revenge for his father, but he never got the chance, and he took that failure out on both himself and his brother. Even with his wife, he couldn't even bring himself to give her a child. That sort of trauma carrying forward and suffocating him. But watching his elder brother die the way he had broken him. Not only had he lost the man who likely understood him more than anyone else, he had once again been far too weak to even participate, and could only stand there and watch. Even afterward, he was too weak to stop his own nephew. He had only barely managed to catch up because Lionel had spent so much time slaughtering. And even now, he couldn't seem to come up with a good reason. Montez took a deep breath, closing his eyes as he exhaled. He regained his calm slowly and opened his eyes. "Your father wanted me to give you something. Please come with me. Show me some respect as your uncle." Lionel remained silent. He looked off into the distance. He had enough time to slaughter the dimensional verse to his heart's content. But if he returned to the human domain now, this form would definitely vanish, and he would fall into a state of dormancy again. The moment he awakened this form, he remembered what had happened that day in the Void Tower. He had entered this state back then, but he had completely forgotten it. This wasn't because something had happened to him, but rather because his mind's capacity in this state was far too vast. If his mind out of his state was a grain of sand, the current him was an entire beach. Just a single second of thought was more than what he had pondered upon his entire life in his other form. As such, when he reverted back, his mind didn't have enough space for all of that information, so it was completely forgotten by him. His best understanding was that this was some sort of latent, hidden lineage factor within himself that he couldn't fully access. He didn't feel that this was just the nature of the lineage factor. Rather, he felt that someone had messed with his body, causing it to be like this. His first thought was his father. After all, that time he passed out in the Raypack's nest, Aina had told him that his father had done something to his body. But he wasn't so sure, and after seeing his uncle in this state, he realized that his skepticism was correct. Lionel raised a hand, and his uncle's body suddenly flew toward him. Montez's expression changed, but it was already too late. Lionel's claws ripped through his chest, tearing by his divine armor as though it wasn't there at all, and piercing his heart from 5 locations all at once, squeezing down without mercy. Occasionally missing content. Please report errors in time. Chapter 2173. Published at 19th of September, 2023. 12:50 and 41 seconds p.m. Chapter 2173. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2173 played. Montez looked toward his nephew, but he didn't quite seem to recognize him anymore. That cold gaze that looked down at him without a single word, as though his life was just as worthless as all the others he had killed. It was heartbreaking. But Montez only felt this for a moment before his consciousness began to fade. Just when it seemed that his death was imminent, Montez's body suddenly erupted with strength. His force nodes were forcefully expanded, and the nodal pathways between them doubled in size, and then doubled again. At the same time, his divine armor shattered one after another until, under a mysterious force, his soul was forcefully separated from his body. But rather than being pulled out entirely, it rather felt that he had gained a great amount of clarity in an incredibly short period of time. Lionel pulled his claw back, allowing his uncle to fall to the ground. Montez's aura continued to grow explosively, as though all of his potential was being unearthed all at once. Lionel observed all of this silently, as though he was watching a science experiment of sorts. He wanted to see what the result would be. Soon his uncle actually began to change as well. A familiar set of dense scales, beautiful and radiant, took shape. Very quickly he became a beautiful creature not much different than Lionel. In fact, he was taller and more magnificent, his power clearly beyond that of Lionel's. The difference, however, was that Montez had been fully awakened while Lionel's lineage factor was clearly very much still in a dormant state. This much was obvious though. Even in this state, Lionel was completely unable to fully awaken himself, and yet he had done so with ease for his uncle. Montez collapsed to the ground, heaving for breath. His scales and horns quickly retreated, his body drenched in sweat. Clearly, he couldn't stay in that state for very long. But inwardly, he was completely astonished. He kept his divine armor activated for every second of his life, rarely taking it off. It was a training method for his body, and one he took pride in since it was created by his father. But just a second in that form had left him completely gassed. He could barely find enough air to breathe. He looked up at Lionel, slowly getting to his feet, not because he had the energy to, but rather because his pride wouldn't allow him to stay down. "What did you just do to me?" "What did I do?" Lionel mumbled. "The better question is what did I just undo?" "I didn't do anything, I just awakened what was already in you." "In me? That's impossible. I've spent too long analyzing my body to." Montez trailed off because Lionel didn't even seem to be listening. It was as though he was in another world, thinking about something else entirely. But Montez felt that he was correct. He was the only one who knew how much effort he had put into improving. It was impossible that he wouldn't have found such a large boost of power hidden within him. He couldn't even fathom what it would take to even begin to hide something like that. It wasn't as though the body was a vast and endless plane. There was a limited amount of space within it, and often one's talent was decided by how efficiently that space was used. And yet, I've heard of a demon race. One that's physically extremely powerful, and yet they prefer to use their minds to mess with people. It's an interesting story, don't you think? Wouldn't it be funny if two brothers were born, but just as talented as one another? Or maybe there was just a small difference between them, and yet the talent of one was sealed away, never to be reached, while the other continued to soar. Lionel's gaze regained its focus as he looked down at his uncle. Would it be interesting? Interesting to watch that family crumble from the inside out. To watch as something that took so little effort on your part practically ruled the world of both of them? Maybe for a god, these sorts of things were the only way to brighten an otherwise dull day. Montez froze. Was he talking about him and Velasco? Lionel's gaze regained its focus as he looked down at his uncle. Would it be interesting? Interesting to watch that family crumble from the inside out. To watch as something that took so little effort on your part practically ruled the world of both of them? Maybe for a god, these sorts of things were the only way to brighten an otherwise dull day. Montez froze. Was he talking about him and Velasco? Don't speak nonsense, Lionel. Montez suddenly felt agitated. He had completely lost his bearing as an uncle. Lionel's words had pierced to the very depths of his soul. Something about his demeanor, his nonchalance, his casualness, had torn through what FAA section Aude he had left as a senior. If Lionel was correct, it meant that he had been played his entire life. He had lost connections with his brother for no other reason than the schemes of a third party. He hadn't given his wife the children she wanted, all because of the schemes of some higher being, snickering at his suffering. He hadn't been able to live the life he wanted to, the life he deserved, all because some god was bored. Lionel, though, didn't even care to respond to this. He was unmoved and unimpressed by the outburst. Instead, his mind was elsewhere. The last time he had entered this state, he did two things. The first was the change to his mage core. He turned it into a tree, filled with countless leaves, each one representing a different rune and a different discipline. It made digesting those various elements far easier for his suppressed self. The second thing he had done was seal the smaller of his two innate nodes, allowing it to naturally progress, once again making it easier for his suppressed self to improve. However, it could only be said that his suppressed self was far too stupid. He had overestimated himself. If others heard this evaluation of a Lionel was already too far beyond others, it was hard to say exactly how they would react, but this current version of him cared for nothing but the fact. Since his uncle had come to stop him, Lionel had already made the decision to return. Whether Montez was telling the truth about his father's remnants or not, even if there was only a 0.1% chance, it was more important than the rest of these people's lives combined. Chapter 2174. Published at 20th of September, 2023, 1:17:30 p.m. Chapter 2174. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2174 bonus. He had decided to return. As far as he was concerned, whether he had this form or not, even if he forgot everything about entering it, it wouldn't make a difference. One way or another, these people would pay in blood. And that was especially so for the spirituals. But before that, there were several of the human domain that he would make suffer for their inaction. The only difference to him was a matter of time. Using this form would take much less effort, but there was no one in this world a match for him given time. They would all suffer one way or another. When he made this decision, Lionel shifted his attention. He moved from thoughts of violence to thoughts of how to maximize his time in this form. Of course, his greatest reliance was his mind. The first thing he did was analyze this new lineage factor. His lineage factor had undergone two changes since he last entered this form. The first was his fusion of it with the Silver Empire's portions, and the second was the constellation event. I see. There's two main changes, and probably several dozen mid-level changes. Let's focus on. Lionel pressed a hand to his chest and closed. He drew 5 deep lines across his chest, but quickly out of the center of his chest, 3 kernels of light appeared. Without much thought, Lionel squeezed a hand and shattered them. These 3 were none other than his 3 divine armors. It was a shame. He didn't even get the chance to use his third, outside of the massacre of the Omen family, but it didn't matter much to him. In his eyes, these products were far too inferior. He could make them thousands of times better, but what he could do now was worthless. He had to create a new design that was both far better, but also within the ability of his suppressed self to comprehend, or else it would be all useless. After not even a split moment of thought, his hand began to draw in the skies and 3 blueprints formed one after another. He hesitated for a moment, but didn't choose to form the 4th. It was better if his suppressed self did it. It would be a good opportunity to improve his dream force further, and that would give him a greater chance of remembering the things he had thought of in this state. If one looked closely at these blueprints, it would be possible to see that the armor wasn't the only part present. In fact, it wasn't just one extra part either. There was not only a spear to pair with, but a bow as well. Lionel waved a hand, and the blueprints vanished. He immediately began to draw another blueprint. Those that were sharp would be able to see that it was actually a starship, but it wasn't just any starship. It was one based on the creation of the Omen family. Lionel was actually creating a blueprint of modifications that would make it far more efficient. He planned to destroy the Omen family soon enough. and he believed that they had definitely already created a fleet of these starships. Obviously, when things were said and done, those starships would be his own to have. This blueprint was like killing two birds with a single stone. It would inform his suppressed self about all the obvious deficiencies that could be taken advantage of, while also strengthening himself a great deal the moment those starships landed in his possession. It took him no more than a few seconds to finish, and he put this blueprint away as well. After he finished this, he pressed two hands to either side of his hips, right over his flaming kidneys. With a thought, they were suppressed and sealed. Soon, the flames flickered out, and they returned to their original states. Everything flowed smoothly, but to Lionel, this was simply too easy. Because he was keeping the level of his suppressed self in mind, he didn't need a lot of time to do things to a standard that his suppressed self would understand. These things were as easy as breathing. He turned his attention to his ethereal glabella. Within, the glorious mage core stood tall and proud, almost entirely unused by his suppressed self. It was astonishing how dense he could be sometimes, but there wasn't much he could do about it. Instead, he turned toward his 10 stars and waved a hand. They began to tremble and quake, solidifying and becoming purer and purer. His vital stars, the only a minimal number of runes, began to quickly catch up with the others. His void star force also began to swiftly gain nodes. Soon they came to a stop. If he did too much, it would have the reverse effect. This was at a level his suppressed self could easily comprehend, thus making things flow far more smoothly. Lionel turned his attention to his body and shook his head. More stupidity. His blood churned, and he shattered the barriers holding back his Northern Star lineage factor, just like he had done in the past. Before, when Lionel lost consciousness, he had suddenly awakened with the starry-tailed fox lineage factor. You would have thought that he would have taken the hint, but apparently he was truly too stupid. While it was true that a lineage factor could suffer without having the appropriate paired techniques, the gap between a 7th-dimensional lineage factor and a peak 8th-dimensional one was so large that it didn't matter. Especially when two peak 8th-dimensional ones could interact and benefit one another greatly. Unfortunately, he didn't have any golden tablets to reach the true pinnacle of these two halves of the Northern Star lineage factor, but this would have to be enough. The roar of a majestic tiger, and the proud shadow of a deer with fur as dark as night and eyes as bright as the starry skies appeared. The tiger had gorgeous white fur and stripes of the brightest gold. Just a single one of its roars seemed capable of collapsing the bounds of reality itself. The golden tiger and the death pulse deer had appeared. Author's note. Lionel and Aina are slipping further and further away from first place in the event tiers. I was going to wait until later to say this, but if we can make it to first place overall by the end of the event, I was going to upload 4 chapters a day again for a 5-day period, so essentially 5 bonus chapters. Anywho, let's just try our best. Erdiel's note. Author is talking about the main character event on WN. You can find it by logging into your account if you have one, and vote with coins on your fave MC and FMC. Chapter 2175. Published at 20th of September, 2023, 1:17 and 32 seconds p.m. Chapter 2175. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2175. Goth's strength in Lionel's body seemed to reach another level. But his reaction was quite benign. He didn't seem to care very much at all. To him, this wasn't very impressive at all. In his current state, whether his Northern Star lineage factor was 7th or 8th dimensional didn't make much of a difference. It would only make a difference if he had the golden tablets for both. In reality, just the fact he had the Death Pulse deer's blood running through him right now was even more impressive because of one simple fact. He had never seen the Dark Side Silver Tablet before. He had instead given it up the chance to Aina, who had gained the Blood Sovereign Tablet. So how did he have the Death Pulse deer bloodline now? The answer was quite simple. Anya. After he had lost himself to rage, Anya's souls had been shattered. She was completely unable to withstand that kind of force, and he didn't care to save her either. However, all of his souls had an undying character. They wouldn't die unless he wanted them to, but that was reliant on his stamina and his intention. After Anya had died, he vanished. The kernel of her soul, or the root that could be used to allow her to resurrect was with him. He just hadn't made any attempt to deal with it. However, just now he had used assimilate on it, and then he had used breathe, the third and final monstrous ability of the Emperor's might lineage factor. Assimilate allowed one to fuse a soul construct with an external item, or fuse a soul into oneself to gain its abilities. Either one worked, though the second had far more restrictions under normal circumstances. However, breathe was very different. With breathe, someone could take a soul, sacrifice an item, and give it life again. This life, however, was very different from the normal, as this soul would remain highly loyal. This was akin to gaining a death sworn by one's side. And the most important part was that they were far more permanent than the original 24-hour period that limited arise. Although, the more powerful the soul, the more powerful the sacrifice required. However, there was a second method of using breathe, and that was similar to the second method of using assimilate. By using assimilate and breathe in unison, Lionel was able to sacrifice a portion of himself in order to give himself the permanence of Anya's ability. In the end, he had chosen to sacrifice the Aurora Panda bloodline within him. Of course, there was a very important issue here. How could he sacrifice an inferior bloodline in order to gain a much stronger one? And that was where the genius of the current Lionel came into play. The potential of the Death Pulse Deer was already within Lionel's body. What was missing was the catalyst. Normally, that catalyst was the comprehension and use of the silver tablet, but with Anya's soul, he didn't need to. He just needed to catch a small spark of the Death Pulse Deer lineage factor. Once he did, he could catalyze the Northern Star lineage factor within his body to force it into being. The short of it was that his Aurora Panda bloodline indeed wasn't enough, but what it was enough for was causing a small fuse to be lit. And before this fuse burnt out, Lionel stimulated it with the rest of his bloodline, forcing it into being. This matter was explained quite simply, but if this was explained to others, the amount of awe they would experience wouldn't be small in the slightest. Lionel had essentially casually figured out a workaround for the need of the tablets. It had to be understood that these tablets weren't just existences used to bestow power, they were also used as a means of control. You weren't meant to be able to access the next unless you were of a certain standard. Without reaching this standard, you would never be able to touch upon this level in your entire life. This was what the Umbra family had experienced until Lionel gave them the bronze tablet of the dark side Northern Star lineage factor. And yet, in just a brief few seconds, Lionel had already figured out a method to circumvent this without even the slightest of effort. He had just broken a code that had left countless generations helpless, with little trouble at all. And yet, he didn't seem like he was done. The three-headed panda construct that had once been so strong for Lionel had already begun to fall by the wayside. This was the reason he was using it less and less recently. The self-created techniques that he had formed and that paired with it so well were too casually constructed. His Lotus domain, for example, was created off the back of a low-level research paper from the Void Library that the current Lionel felt was nothing more than trash. Its construction was shoddy and it didn't have staying power at higher dimensional levels. He could do much better. Whether it was the Golden Tiger or the Death Pulse Deer, they both had exceptional combat prowess. Lionel had already taken this into account when he had created the blueprints for his divine armors. They would take great advantage of this. But in order for it to work, he had to fuse the two first. His body began to change, and he grew even taller. His scales vanished beneath strong tufts of white fur, his eyes becoming a sparkling golden color, his horns becoming even more prominent and powerful, shimmering with a black luster. The Death Pulse Deer controlled Death Force, the Golden Tiger, however, controlled Golden Force. It was a very special variant Earth-type force known for its astounding offensive power. Golden Force was constructed of variant Earth Force, Spatial Force, Star Force, and Light Force. It was considered to be the force with the greatest piercing power in all of existence, aside from weapon forces mastered to an extreme. Death Force, of course, spoke for itself. Now Lionel had fused the two halves into a perfect whole. His eyes regained their focus, and he looked back down toward his uncle, who was still in an agitated state. He grabbed his shoulder. Chapter 2176. Published at 20th of September, 2023, 1:17 and 58 seconds p.m. Chapter 2176. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2176. I swear not long later, Lionel had appeared before his father again, his uncle by his side. His gaze flickered as he looked at the man, his rage threatening to bubble up again. Montez's gaze flickered with its own complicated light. The words that Lionel had spoken had truly weighed heavily on him. His relationship with his elder brother had once been very good. If he thought about it, it was indeed his fault that it had reached the state it had. He clenched his fist. I swear I'll kill whoever did this to us. Although he thought this, the amount of self-blame was palpable. He didn't say anything for a long while, and it was only after he felt the coldness emitting from Lionel that he remembered how things had reached this point. He actually hadn't been lying. Velasco had indeed left something behind. The only lie was that it wasn't exactly meant for Lionel, although it would benefit him greatly. Your father. Val said that after a ninth-dimensional expert died, there would be a great phenomenon. The land they stood within would gain a great boon, even more beneficial than a world entering the eighth dimension. Depending on the strength of the expert, it might even be better than a world entering the ninth dimension. I didn't have much of a reference for that until recently, but if he's right, the change would be enormous. Do you know why there isn't a phenomenon here? Lionel wanted to hope, but his uncle's eyes painted a completely different story. There was truly no use in him having hope. His father was indeed dead. Your father has always been a selfish man. How could he allow others to benefit from his death? Montez opened Velasco's shirt with shaking hands and revealed a necklace. He slowly took it off and handed it to Lionel. Give this to Anastasia. Tell her that Val said he always keeps his promises. Lionel's jaw clenched as he took the necklace. It looked as though an entire universe was spinning within the gem that hung from it. In this state, he could vaguely remember some things. Back when he had lost to Amory, Anastasia had nursed him to health, swearing about how he was holding her back, and how he was just as useless as his father. She had also mentioned something about his father promising to bring her back to the ninth dimension, implying that she had once been there before. What happened to Anastasia? I'm not sure, but when she fell into father's hands, she was already heavily injured. But after Val lost himself to rage after father's death, Anastasia fell even further, descending to the point that she was barely at the third dimension anymore. She even had to fall into a deep sleep. Your father was slowly nursing her injuries until he left her to you. Montez hesitated for a moment, but in the end he decided to speak. Your father has been very powerful for a long while. Back then, he had already broken free of the restrictions of the world. Lionel frowned. You're wondering why he died this time, but not back then? I think you're already smart enough to know the answer. Montez looked down at the necklace. Suddenly Lionel understood. His father had already broken free of the restrictions of this world, but if he had continued to do so, he would have died that day. He probably relied on Anastasia to avoid punishment back then, causing her to be heavily injured and almost die. Thinking about how angry Anastasia was when his father hadn't come to say hello after so long, Lionel felt he understood his father even deeper than before. It wasn't that his father was so aloof. He didn't want to see Anastasia so that she would remain angry, continuing to ignore him. That way, when he acted this time, she wouldn't do something as foolish as trying to protect him again. Because this time, if she really dared to interfere again, she really would die. Lionel clenched the necklace in his hand. Without a word, he sent it into the segmented cube and crushed it before Anastasia could understand what happened. A large amount of energy rushed forward, as though the skies were filled with golden blood. What once were blue and expansive became bold and beautiful. Anastasia rushed out, seemingly focused on something in the lab. She looked into the skies in a daze before her senses extended outside of the finger sleeve Lionel always wore. She had indeed not been paying much attention, but when she saw the state of the void battlefield, and then rewound the events play by play, she froze. Her little face became ghastly pale, and her big, larger-than-life blue eyes reddened. Even the adorable little blue cloud that made up her lower body darkened. rumbling with arcs of lightning. Her aura surged, quickly approaching the pinnacle of the 8th dimension and then shattering a path through to the 9th. But this only caused the tears she was holding back to spill forth. Idiot! 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 Her small body rushed out of the finger sleeve, her little fists pounding against Velasco's body. Unfortunately, Velasco's body had already lost all of its strength. The power holding up was no longer there, the necklace having already been taken. Anastasia panicked when the body began to fall, forgetting all about the huge amount of power at her fingertips. She bawled her eyes out, helpless and weak before the changes. Lionel took a step forward, barely catching his father's body before it crashed, catching it. His gaze carried a frigid cold within them, looking off into the distance. He seemed to peer through the veil of reality, looking toward the enemies and marking each one of them in the heart. Whether it was the invaders, or the cowardly humans who remained on the sideline. I swear I'll kill them all. Lionel barely had this thought himself before he too collapsed, his body exploding with clouds of blood. Chapter 2177. Published at 29th of September, 2023, 9 o'clock and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 2177. Sharper. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's eyes snapped open. It was probably a common occurrence among normal people to be partially confused about where they were, or maybe forget about what had happened recently, especially after being asleep for so long. But while the events of his transformation were blurry to Lionel, it was much less so than it had been in the past. In addition, his mind was far too fast to fall into such a trap. In the end, he remembered it all instantly. He didn't get the hope of a few seconds of bliss. The instant his eyes opened, he was plunged into a pit he didn't know how to get out of. He simply stared blankly at the ceiling. But even this was short-lived. Not even a few seconds later, Lionel stood to his feet. He had work to do. He didn't contact Aina, he didn't go to see how his mother was doing. He didn't even try to communicate with Anastasia despite the fact he was already aware that he was within the abode setting. Instead, he directly entered the lab and pulled out 3 blueprints. His mind's capacity was far beyond what it had been in the past. As such, the gap wasn't as exaggerated as it had been back when he had first entered Void Tower, and he was able to remember bits and snippets. At the same time, his more enlightened self had been ready as well, sealing off much of what it could, and leaving behind only what he felt that the current Lionel could handle. As such, Lionel remembered the most important points. He remembered the blueprints, whether that was his divine armor, or that of the modifications to the starship. He also understood some of the changes that had been made to his body, and he was aware that he had awoken 2 new lineage factors, though they now seamlessly acted as one. He was also aware that he needed to pay more attention to his mage core in the future, and understand it to a greater degree. But for now he was focused on these blueprints before him. What astonished him was how simple the materials were, and the path they took was even more curious. There was very clearly a heavy emphasis on his new lineage factors, namely the Golden Tiger and Death Pulse Deer lineage factors, but it hadn't completely abandoned the path of vitality that he had laid out either. It used concepts of death and life to find greater life and vitality than even Lionel thought possible. At the same time, it opened up a door toward a fusion of his talents that Lionel had never considered before. The way Lionel saw it, Aina had always been able to keep up with him because her ability to focus her talents into a single path was simply unmatched. Even without much effort on her part, all of her skills, whether it was ability index and lineage factor, all came together seamlessly. In fact, there was a very long time where Lionel couldn't even tell where her lineage factor ended, and where her ability index began. His more enlightened self had seen through this problem clearly and gave him a solution. His divine armor. Now his divine armor, or more accurately his metal body, though even this wasn't wholly accurate any longer, could accommodate both an armor and 2 weapons. This gave him a level of flexibility that hadn't been there before. This added flexibility opened a door of possibility that if he should walk through, he would be able to become an entirely new person. One that could stand toe-to-toe with Aina in terms of how streamlined and perfectly meshed his talents were in one. There was some bad news though, unfortunately. As great as an idea that this was, there was a huge elephant in the room. His spear and bow sovereignty. In the past, it was his spear domain ring that didn't allow him to touch inferior spears. He had never even attempted to craft a spear before, because it would have been a useless effort. He didn't quite understand where that kernel of worthiness stemmed from. It made sense that he was confused. After all, the spear domain ring was filled to the brim with swords of all kinds, from those formed of the most inoffensive and cheap wood, to those constructed of the holiest and most precious materials known to man. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it outside of a mysterious something that set them apart from everyone else. One might say that Lionel no longer needed the ring. He could just set it aside now that he had sovereignty of his own. Plus, the spears within were useless to him as they wouldn't mesh with his divine armors perfectly. It would be better to set them aside. However, therein lied a problem. Because he didn't need to rely on the ring anymore. The source of the trouble was no longer external. If he tried to craft an inferior spear now, or even an inferior bow as well, for that matter, the result would be the same. Failure. It wouldn't be a ring that destroyed the spear anymore, but rather Lionel's aura itself. The only past this was to figure out what that kernel was, and finally forge a true spear for himself. But all he had here was a blueprint, and he didn't even need to try to know that just following it wouldn't be enough to reach that standard. It was almost too silly. He was a spear sovereign, a true spear sovereign, and yet he had no confidence in forging a spear. His gaze turned colder and colder, until it reached such an abyssal absolute zero that he couldn't quite even see clearly anymore. He clenched his fists and closed his eyes. This sort of agitation wasn't helping him in the slightest. It was only wasting his mental strength on useless emotion. When his eyes opened once more, they were several-fold sharper. Chapter 2178. Published at 29th of September, 2023, 9 o'clock and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 2178. Intent. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel tossed another aside, his expression indifferent. He felt by this point that maybe his enlightened self had created a blueprint that used such cheap materials, anticipating that he would fail so often. Even though he was only working on a fourth dimension blueprint right now, even fourth dimensional materials when piled up to a high enough degree would make him feel a pinch, especially since he was in a stage where he was completely focused on saving as much material as possible for the coming battles he planned to fight. Lionel tossed yet another aside, not even bothering to continue it. He already knew that it was a failure. The design of this spear he was attempting to craft was ingenious. It used the simplest elemental ores, sticking to the basics and using them to create something new. Their power would only show when they came together as one, entering the true life-grade realm. Often, ores like these ones were used in amplification force arts, ones that could increase the concentration of certain forces in a given area. This was something that the Void Palace had quite a lot of. In fact, they had so many that they wouldn't even bother with fourth-dimensional materials like this one, or even sixth-dimensional ones. They directly began at the seventh, which was why these materials were seen as so cheap in Lionel's eyes. Thinking back to how many of his points he had wasted back in the Cataclysm Zone, gathering the most expensive of materials, Lionel realized that he had been going down the wrong path of crafting, or at the very least, life-grade crafting. Life-grade crafting was meant to create new life from the materials that forged it. The more dominant the material, the more resistant it would be to change. Using high-class, high-level materials was actually the antithesis of what he really wanted, and he was actually holding himself back. That wasn't to say that you weren't allowed to use high-class materials, but the issue was that he had overstepped his bounds in some respects and underappreciated himself in others. He had overstepped his bounds in the regard that he had only just entered the life grade. He could be considered a fledgling to the discipline. What right had he earned to already be working with the best materials already? As for how he had underappreciated himself, one only had to ask one simple question. What point was there in using the highest class materials of the fourth dimension? What about the fifth? Or the sixth? It had to be remembered that the entry of the life grade by many was seen to be the eighth dimension. This wasn't a coincidence. After one entered the gold grade, it didn't matter how great the materials were, even if one used ninth-dimensional materials, of course. Only if you were able to refine such materials despite only being in the gold grade there wouldn't be a qualitative leap in terms of treasure strength, unless one understood the concepts of the life grade. This was to say that materials less meaningful at the lower level of the life grade. How could it matter much whether you used a low-class or a high-class fourth-dimensional material, when your aim was the life grade anyway? It was a waste of effort. It was better to simplify things, to go back to the basics, to choose materials one comprehended to their very roots and bring out the best in each and every one of them. Go back to the basics. Bloop. Lionel's fingers flickered, and little Tolly went into action, moving with swift speed. Lionel's action seemed far sharper, and his true spear sovereign aura towered. He thought back to what it would take to forge a wooden spear. Carefully picking out a branch, checking its sturdiness, letting it dry, then carefully beginning to carve it with a knife. Each one of your strokes would carry your intent. The thought of forging a spear. Was it long enough? Was it sturdy enough? Was it flexible enough? How did it feel in your hands? When using a metal spirit to forge an item, it was easy to forget these things. You were detached from the material, the spirit becoming the medium of your efforts, and disconnecting you from the process of the spear's creation. In such a situation, how could you gain access to its truest strength? How could it feel the dignity of a sovereign? At that moment, Lionel understood. He was trying to form a life grade spear. The life grade represented new life, a new creation. If he just threw the materials together, following the blueprint, would this new life grade spear even have the understanding that it was now a spear? Or would it feel that it was a rod? A glaive maybe? Lionel had always had this question in his mind. There were many so-called spears in the spear domain ring that looked a lot more like other weapons. Some looked like glaives. Some could be separated into two pieces and wielded like twin swords. Some looked like tridents. Even his favorite spear in recent memory looked like nothing more than a long black rod until its foggy blade took shape. So, what was the separation? What decided what was a spear and what wasn't? The answer was obvious now that he thought about it. It was the intention. If he wanted to create a life-grade spear, he had to have the intention to do so from the very beginning. But that begged a question. Why were there bronze, silver and gold-grade spears within the ring? Then, there were even black-grade spears as well. But Lionel felt there was an answer to this too, and it was related to the reason why the higher in quality one went, the further one traveled into the spear domain ring, the more spears of these higher caliber could be found. Lionel retrieved little Tolly, and a pulsing light radiated. The roar of a tiger and the proud prance of a deer king echoed, flashes of light and dark piercing outward. He had succeeded. Chapter 2179. Published at 29th of September, 2023, 9:40 a.m. Chapter 2179. Return if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The answer was quite simple. When those spears began their life, they had no intention of becoming the weapon of sovereigns. It was only after a long journey, and a life by their side, that they evolved and entered the state they were in. However, most normal spearmen probably couldn't even notice how special they were. Even Lionel couldn't grasp it. Until now. Holding his forged spear in one hand, Lionel extended his other, and a wooden spear appeared. Lionel remembered this stinger-like spear quite intimately. It was the second ever spear he had gotten from the spear domain ring, the first having been destroyed due to his carelessness. Usually the spear domain ring could repair damaged spears, but this was only up to a point his first spear had passed unfortunately. This spear, however, was owned by a female spearmaster. She was quite crafty in her bearing and the way she used a spear was light and agile, quick and sharp. She had taught Lionel a lot about cautiousness and precision in battle, not to mention cleverness. Without even noticing, she was probably a large reason why Lionel's battle style had become the way it was, even aside from the state of his ability index. It was one of the spears he was most familiar with, intimately so. And yet, in his hands right now, it felt completely different. It had soul, it had heart. He casually pierced outward, and the spear seemed to sing. Lionel stood in silence for a very long time. That feeling, he had seen it before. His father's last spear strike. It was much weaker, by an impossibly wide margin, but he was certain that they shared the same roots. At the same time, his spear force, which had been at the third layer, transcended to the fourth, faintly touching upon the next level. That spear strike that had taken him 333 strokes to complete could now be executed casually by him. If he executed his spear dance, he might be able to take a half step into the impetus state, a level of strength that was practically an infinite distance from the fourth layered state. It had to be remembered that the impetus state was the requirement for entering the ninth dimension, and now Lionel was just a step away. However, he had no plans on relying on this. That was because he had no intention of suppressing his spear force. Once he entered the seventh dimension, he would allow it to smoothly enter the seventh dimension as well, and as a result, his spear force would fall back from the fourth layered state to the third layered state. Even so, the feeling of the fourth layered state in his hands right now made him feel invincible. The power to use such strength so casually made him feel like a completely new person. With this kind of strength, defeating Amory, or at least the Amory he had last battled, would be a matter of a single stroke of his blade. Even if he entered the seventh dimension, he wouldn't suddenly weaken, he would probably actually become a slight margin strong. After all, the gap between the sixth and seventh dimensions would make up for the gap between the third and fourth layered state. Lionel slowly put the stinger spear away and gripped his self-created spear. It was truly beautiful and it radiated a unique aura. It felt better in his hands than any spear he had ever touched, as though it was created for him. And that it was. It sparked with what looked like muted lightning. Its shaft filled out with hexagonal scales that shimmered with a golden light between their bodies. Its blade had a dark gold body and its sharp edge was like a radiant black light, even looking somewhat purple and ethereal. The next progressions of the spear looked similar. The only real difference was that the fifth-dimensional one was 3 meters long and far more flexible, similar to a wind spear he had used in the past. As for the sixth-dimensional one, it was 4 meters long and had twin heads. Now that Lionel had succeeded with one, he was far more confident that he would succeed with the others. He closed his hands tight, and the blade disappeared into his body, a shuddering strength shooting within him as the fusion process completed. He had never experienced this before when fusing, or rather, the effect was always minimal. But this time, it felt as though everything had changed. Without much more thought, he began to work on the others, moving swiftly as though he didn't have time to lose, and he truly didn't. Every time he thought about his father's final moments, the fire within him burned fiercer and fiercer. He wanted to destroy everything, to watch the world burn. That fire spurred him on, and he worked faster and faster. In just a day, he had finished all of his armors. To his surprise, no one had come to bother him, but he also didn't mind. He preferred it this way. He didn't want to socialize, to speak to others. It would only delay his revenge. After he was finished, he entered a pod even though he didn't absolutely need to. He had rather done it because he knew exactly what kind of workload was facing him. Once he finished modifying the starship, he would start making plans to return to the Morales family. But the kind of return they expected was most definitely not the one he would give them. However, before he even thought about that, he would most definitely enter the seventh dimension. Of all the kernels that his enlightened self had left for him, this was probably one of the more important. If he had to find a key to enter the dimensional cleanse trial world, and then wait for the other keys to be found and everyone to be ready to enter, who knew how much time would pass? Luckily, his enlightened self had left behind enough of the deductions he would need. Once he entered the seventh dimension, he would return to the Morales as Patriarch Lionel. Chapter 2180. Published at 29th of September, 2023, 9 o'clock and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 2180. Real Mother. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2180. Real Mother. The starship could be considered to be Cynthia's magnum opus, the greatest blueprint she had ever constructed and the best craft that she had ever been a part of. Even so, there were many faults with it, most of which surrounded its shrunken size. A regular starship was capable of lasting without a replacement of its core for at least a decade without issue, but Cynthia's could only last a single year. This was still not bad, as a year was a relatively long time in the scale of a war, at least. However, this 90% drop was something that hurt quite a bit. The reason for this was that because the core, a fusion core, was an object that simulated the power of a star. It was extremely powerful. The amount of power within it was obscene. If it wasn't like this, how could it power such a large vessel? But it was also ironic because of this that the fusion core lasts a shorter time on this modified starship, rather than longer despite its smaller size. There were a few reasons for this. The first was cooling, the second was capacity, and the final was size, this time referring to the core's size instead of the ship's. The cooling of the fusion core didn't just happen within the engine room, but rather throughout the entire ship. The main method used was also the easiest and most effective, and that was diffusion. By using special cooling pathways more effective than even copper could hope to be, the heat was evenly distributed throughout the ship. The problem was that because the size of the starship was a handful of kilometers, as opposed to the thousands of kilometers of the original starship, the change in size was far too drastic to accommodate the original fusion core. The second problem was one of capacity, and that was that the smaller starship simply didn't have enough mechanisms that could be powered. Fusion cores had a great amount of volatile energy, and it could only calmed and parsed to a certain degree. After a certain point, it would refuse to split. As such, a much smaller starship could be easily overloaded. In order to deal with these problems, Cynthia had chosen to shrink the size of the fusion core, and the method she used was actually quite ingenious, but it unfortunately only further exacerbated the problem. Now that the fusion core was also smaller, there was less overall energy, and ultimately there was the trouble result of a shorter shelf life. This was the trade-off that had come with a smaller core, and this was just one of the major problems the starship faced. The second issue was one of defense, and this unfortunately fed into more of the size of the vessel. The main mode of defense for both starships were their protective force arts. However, for the smaller of the two, this was basically the only mode of protection, and it wasn't as good as the first. It required access to much more energy to complete the same tasks. Of course, since the starship was smaller, the area its force art took up was much smaller as well. But that also meant that it had much less area to take up. When it took on attacks, there was much less room to disperse said attacks, and as a result, it took more energy to deal with the same trouble, once again resulting in a decrease in its shelf life. The larger a force art, controlling for quality, the more powerful it was. This was a simple rule. But even more importantly than that, in this case, the more material used as the foundation of a force art, the more powerful it was. But this was unfortunately another problem that the smaller starship had to suffer in to gain the benefits it had. The third and the final major issue was speed. In truth, the smaller starship was both far more agile and far faster. Where it suffered was in using space jumps. Its personal gravitational pull was highly limited due to its much smaller size, and as such its size couldn't be used as a personal shortcut to opening up a spatial tunnel. As a result of this, it took a great deal of time for the smaller of the two starships to move across large distances. Even though in confined spaces, it far outstripped the larger one. In order to make up for this deficit, the smaller of the two starships once again had to compensate with more energy usage, once again placing it even further behind. These were the three most major issues, while the rest were more miscellaneous. Lionel planned to not only fix this, but he also planned to improve upon the starship's strengths as well. In fact, he planned to use the material of this one starship to craft 3 more. He would also use the much larger of the 2 starships to construct an entire fleet, but he wouldn't be able to do that until he finally brought little Tali beyond the 5th dimension. However, in order to help little Tali evolve, he would have to find a force eruption, and there was only one place that he could guarantee would have one. And that was none other than the Morales territory, which was currently undergoing a huge evolution. For now he would focus on this matter. "Let's do it," Lionel said lightly, taking little Tali along with him. This would be a large project, even larger than the creation of his divine armor, but soon he would be ready. Right outside of the segmented cube, a trio of women sat. The atmosphere was quite somber. Empress Fox gently rubbed her daughter's back, her eyes slightly puffy from crying. She didn't want to see her daughter like this either. Eleanor was always cheery and full of life, but now she could only be said to be the complete opposite. "He's awake?" Eleanor asked. Aina, the third woman among them, nodded her head slowly. Slowly, Eleanor's gaze went from downcast to sharp, and then from sharp to sharper. "Let's not bother him. Tell me when he comes out. It's about time I was a real mother to him." Chapter 2181. Published at 29th of September, 2023, 9 o'clock and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 2181. Foreign if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2181. Foreign Lionel exhaled a long breath, his face marred with fatigue. Even little Tali, who Lionel had never seen exhibit such signs before, also seemed to be worn out. It was clear that this was already pushing the little guy's ability. If others knew that Lionel had accomplished so much with a fifth-dimensional metal spirit, it was hard to say how they would react. However, this was meaningless to him. What was important was that he had succeeded. In a spacious field of the segmented cube, 3 ships, each exactly a kilometer long large. They were all sleek and powerful. And yet despite hovering in the air, the grass beneath them only swayed gently as though a delicate gust of wind was passing by instead of the behemoth-like starships they really were. In Lionel's estimation, this starship was at least twice as strong as the previous one in terms of both offense and defense, and in terms of speed it was 3 times faster and more agile. On top of all of that, it would last 5 years instead of the previous estimation of 1 despite having had its fusion core separated into 3 pieces. And on top of that it could not only form space tunnels, unlike the larger starship, it could cancel mid-flight and avoid an interception. Lionel believed that this ship was no worse than the Tier 1 starships of Shield Cross stars, despite the fact it was made only of Tier 2 materials. On top of that, it was far more versatile and stealthy. If Lionel ever got his hands on a Tier 1 starship, he wouldn't need his enlightened self to return. With what he had learned building these 3, he would be able to modify any that came across him. What was maybe the best about this starship, though, was the fact that it could be controlled by a single person. Usually, Lionel had to make hundreds of clones, thousands for the larger one. Only then could he barely control one at great cost to himself. But now, even someone far inferior to him in terms of mental capacity could control these ships. This starship was truly on a level of its own. Lionel dragged his body to a pod and remained inside for half a day. This was the equivalent of an entire 48 days, but when he came out his aura was primed and powerful. A large rush of auspicious air manifested around him, and his 10 stars appeared. He closed his eyes, the sweatpants he wore fluttering in the air wildly as he continued to take deep breaths. Dimensional cleanse had always been a unique technique to Lionel. It almost felt that it had come to him by choice rather than him conspicuously picking it out after exiting the Mayan tomb. There was clearly a tie between it and the Cataclysm Zone. This was something that Lionel had only casually concluded in the past, but the more he learned about the Cataclysm Zone, the more he felt that dimensional cleanse wasn't as simple as he thought it to be. Dimensional cleanse had opened up the world of true universal cycles to him, teaching him the uniqueness of it all, and giving him a peek into a power that exceeded himself. As a result, his own universal cycles were extremely powerful. By this point, especially considering his enemies, the heavenly body realm he had once been in should have been useless, but he was still able to use it to fight against the likes of Amory. Now that he had entered the natural light realm, he felt that it too was somewhat connected. The sounds of a shattering barrier resounded, and Lionel's body pulsed with a wild light. His body expanded and contracted wildly, seemingly growing to as much as double his size before shrinking back down to his original again and again. It was an incredibly odd feeling, and it was the kind of breakthrough he had never experienced before. An overwhelming power ascended from within the depths of his body, his strength leaping to tens of times his original in an instant before beginning to double continuously, as though it would never stop. Lionel exhaled a slow breath as it all came to a stop. When he opened his eyes, the world seemed simpler, less involved, easier to manipulate. His dream force affinity seemed to have increased again, and he remembered even more of what his enlightened self had experienced, albeit still a fraction of a fraction. It's time to go, Lionel said lightly. His first destination wouldn't actually be the Morales family. Instead, it would be the Umber family. It was about time he cashed some checks. He didn't even bother to think about the Skies family and the likes. He felt they were too inferior for what he needed to do. And though they were currently benefiting from the evolution of their land under Earth's influence, it would take at least a generation for those benefits to truly settle in. By then, he would hopefully be on to other things. The moment Lionel stepped out from the segmented cube, though a gust of gentle wind formed, a beautiful woman appeared before him. A familiar fragrance assaulted his senses before he even looked down to find Aina. She had a complicated look in her eye, not quite certain of what to say or how to say it. She was also worried about how Lionel would react to her presence. She felt like she was walking on eggshells. She was faintly aware that it wasn't normal to feel this way, but there was also nothing she could do about it. In the end, she simply wrapped her arms around Lionel tightly, burying her head into his chest. She didn't say anything. She had lost her mother as well, and she knew just how much Lionel cared about his father. This was a pain that she understood all too well. She felt Lionel hesitated slightly, but she relaxed when she felt his arms wrap around her as well. At that moment, a golden-haired woman emitting an air of maturity appeared. She looked quite dignified and sharp, an aura familiar to her and those that had known her for many years, but one completely foreign to her son. Chapter 2182. Published at 29th of September, 2023, 9:31 a.m. Chapter 2182. Your plans. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2182. Your plans. Lionel met his mother's gaze. He didn't really react very much. Usually he could be quite charismatic, but that wasn't because it was his true personality. It was rather because he could analyze a situation and understand the best way to respond. But he simply wasn't in the mood. It could be said that he was rarely his true self, but right now he very much was. He didn't have much to give, and he didn't really want to take either. But given his mother's expression, it seemed that she was well aware of this, something that surprised Lionel. If he had known that she had been a bundle of emotions just a day prior, he probably wouldn't believe it. However, this sort of reaction suited him just fine. He wasn't in the mood to console others. If he had to, he might very well just directly leave so that he wouldn't say something he would come to regret. What are your plans? Eleanor asked. Kill. Lionel replied simply. Okay, Eleanor replied simply. Mom will help you. Lionel's gaze flickered, but he didn't say anything else. He simply vanished out from Aina's arms, disappearing from everyone's sight. Aina lowered her arms, feeling somewhat helpless. However, she knew Lionel well enough to know that he dealt with things his own way. Remembering the words that his other self seemed to have spoken, she regained some of her calm. The fact that he had spoken those words meant something clear. This wouldn't last forever. And that was all the confirmation she needed. When Lionel had first begun to pursue her, he had been the one that was extremely patient. Because she never said no and gave him no signs of direct refusal, he continued to ask. That was his own sort of resolve. And it was because of her own complicated feelings that she had strung him along for long, but not once had he ever complained about it, nor had he ever held it against her. He had just lost his father. If she didn't even have this much patience, then what good was it for her to be in a relationship at all? Lionel took control of one of his starships the moment he entered Earth's orbit, zipping out of Earth's solar system in the blink of an eye. Yip. Yip. An adorable little mink appeared above Lionel's shoulder, slithering down and curling in his lap. Lionel took a glance down before looking away. The small bit of warmth on his thighs, silent and guarded, was all he felt he needed. The starship appeared within Umbra family territory, with a great amount of speed. Lionel descended and sent the ship into the segmented cube's finger sleeve before descending. He didn't wait for anyone and directly entered the Capitol building of the Umbra, or maybe it was more accurately a palace. It wasn't long before people reacted, and even more quickly, Radley's aunt Selton appeared before him. "Lionel," Selton greeted, though her expression was a bit weird. She, along with many others, had seen what had happened that day, at least vaguely. The system was only designed to follow lower-level 7th-dimensional battles, so one could imagine how many details had been missed when observing a battle nearing the 9th-dimensional level, and even directly entering it. However, it was still enough for her to understand the gist of what had happened, at least up until the death of Lionel's family. Lionel nodded faintly. Selton frowned inwardly, feeling that Lionel's attitude was a bit too disrespectful. Her strength level wasn't something the current Lionel could fathom. She was well aware of what had happened in the Air Wars. She had watched attentively along with everyone else. After all, they had sent some of their best inside, and wanted to be ready to take action in case any of them were exposed. However, Selton restrained her true inner thoughts. She could imagine what Lionel was going through. She too had lost many people she cared about, many at the hands of the Three-Finger Cult. So, she didn't blame him too much and simply waited for him to explain why he had come, but what she heard next caught her completely off guard. "I will give the Umbra family a choice now. There is no in-between. And there won't be time to regret later. Stand by my side in a war against the greatest powers of the human domain, or don't. What will your choice be?" Selton froze. Of all the things she had expected to hear, this was the very last. Hadn't Lionel just become the patriarch of the Morales? Was that why he was asking? Did he believe that the Morales were about to be attacked by the rest of the human domain? That was possible, but it shouldn't happen for a while though? Who would attack right after a domain war? Especially right after it was a Morales death that had pretty much protected them all? You mean you would like to ask us whether we want to help defend the Morales? She probed. This was a much different ask than the meaning behind Lionel's words, but she felt that she had to ask anyway. "I meant exactly what I said," Lionel replied plainly. Selton's frown deepened. By this point, the rest of the upper echelon had realized that something important was happening, but their reactions were much fiercer than Selton's, and they were much more unable to hide their expressions. "We can't just. The Three-Finger Cult's upper echelon has been almost entirely destroyed. All that remains are likely their variant invalids and maybe a few hidden branches. There is no reason for you to continue to hide." This. Selton's heart skipped a beat, but her resistance seemed to only grow. "All right," Lionel said coolly. "The bronze tablet. Return it." Selton froze and her resistance reached its peak. Lionel didn't seem to want to waste any time. The moment he saw Selton's hesitation, he knew what the answer would be. However, when he saw her reaction to the returning of his property, his gaze became frighteningly cold, so much so that Selton seemed to be snapped awake. It didn't feel like she was facing a youth any longer. Chapter 2183. Published at 29th of September, 2023, 9:30 a.m. Chapter 2183. Indifference if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2183. Indifference. Lionel didn't move. He only continued to look at Selton. His expression didn't seem to have changed in the slightest, but the frigid aura emitting from him was palpable. At that moment, Radley's and Patriarch Xylem both appeared. Radley's had long since returned to the Umbra family, and the latter felt quite helpless. Xylem was nothing more than a figurehead. He was only in the 6th dimension, and he wasn't in a position to truly lead the Umbra family. But Lionel's strength was something that was deeply imprinted into him. Although he couldn't use his full strength at the same, Lionel, a boy at merely the 5th dimension, and not even the peak of it but rather only at Tier 1, fought several patriarchs all on his own, killing most of them and forcing the rest to heal. There was an imprint of Lionel deep within his heart. An imprint that Selton clearly didn't share despite having been present for Lionel breaking through 2 tiers of the 6th dimension in a single bound. The Umbra family had been on the sideline for too long. If Xylem had to be honest with himself, Although their stated goal was to gather their strength and eventually eliminate the three-finger cult, the reality was that they weren't doggedly pursuing this goal every waking minute. They had grown complacent, and now that the three-finger cult had been dealt such a devastating blow even without them lifting a finger, they were even more so. Many had changed their goals. They felt that they could finally appear in the outside world once more, competing for hegemony in the human domain, and even the wider dimensional verse. As for the bronze tablet, they had never had any intention of returning. Their ancestors were part of the founding of the three-finger cult, and though they had to escape, if there were any remnants of the cult, then it was rightfully their own. Of course, they didn't know that this bronze tablet wasn't from their cult at all. Rather, it was a reward that Lionel had taken for himself from the Cataclysm Zone. It had nothing to do with them outside of the fact it happened to complete the same function. But even if Lionel explained this matter, something he couldn't be bothered to, would this change their position? At most, it would just make them more shameless. 3, Lionel said lightly. Selton frowned, understanding what this meant. 2. She froze, suddenly realizing what Lionel was doing. The humiliation and pride within her chest exploded. How dare he dash? 1. Lionel suddenly punched out. Anti-Selton. Radley's roared out, but it was too late. Bang! Lionel's fist shot through Selton's chest, shattering her heart into pieces. It was so furious and fast that Lionel's knuckles and wrist were entirely untouched by flesh and blood, a hole around his arm forming large enough for it to pass through unobstructed. Selton froze, looking down and not quite believing what had just happened. She was dead. That was impossible. There was still so much to do. She still had so much talent to unearth. She hadn't even brought out her greatest strength. She hadn't even. Her eyes dimmed and she fell back, crashing into the ground. Lionel. Radley's roared. He couldn't believe what was happening. There was still room for discussion. Why did he attack without saying anything? That was his aunt, a woman that had doted on him since he was a child. Although they weren't that close, he still saw Lionel as somewhat of a friend. Just that they were unfortunate enough to separate before their relationship could deepen. But now, Lionel couldn't seem to hear him at all. He stepped over Selton's corpse as though it was worthless, moving slowly into the Umber family's territory. His internal sight flourished, and he locked onto a certain location. There simply wasn't anything in the whole of this planet that could escape his senses. The elders in the surroundings had been stunned into silence. But when they finally processed what had happened, their eyes turned red with rage. Several manifestations rose into the air. Some were still shadow tails, but many more were dusky steel bats, and even more than that were aurora black pandas. Selton was a woman they all respected to the bottom of their hearts. Although she only led the surface of the family, it was only a matter of time before she entered the true core of the family and became one of their pillars. But now she was dead far too early. Their fury reached a tempest, but for every one that charged forward, Lionel would only punch out once. Chests caved, heads burst like watermelons, cries of agony and pleas of murder echoed through the skies. The thick scent of death filling the skies and rising like a tide before washing down like a tsunami. Lionel didn't have any leniency, he didn't have any mercy, he killed indiscriminately. The moment he had taken Selton's life, there was already no more room for negotiation. And he didn't care to negotiate either. You were either with him, or you would die. There was no other option. At that moment, truly powerful auras began to approach one after another. The majority were infinitely close to the 8th dimension, definitely in a quasi-realm of sorts, but at least 3 of them were true ancestors. It was clear with a thought that the Umber family had indeed been hiding away their true strength, but this was something that had been obvious to Lionel the moment he had learned that they were in fact once a part of the three-finger cult. Stop! One of the ancestors roared. He was a stalwart man and seemed to look like a panda himself, even having dark, deeply sunken eyes. His words were forceful and powerful, but his expression was ugly as he looked at the carnage before him. Just what had happened here? Lionel looked up, his expression indifferent. Chapter 2184. Published at 29th of September, 2023, 9 o'clock and 28 seconds AM Chapter 2184. First casualty. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2184. First casualty. When the pan-like ancestor's eyes landed on Selton's body, his expression became even uglier, but he struggled to force himself to calm down. How could he not recognize Lionel? He knew that this man was the current patriarch of the Morales family. If they were to do something to him, it would be about as good as declaring war. And if they were ready for something like that against such a behemoth, they would have already attacked the Three-Finger Cult to get their revenge. But at the same time, he couldn't just let things go like this. That was impossible. They had their own bottom line as well. The panda ancestor, a man named Jeffner, took a breath trying to calm himself. He didn't interact with the world much for obvious reasons, so these types of matters weren't what he was good at, but he was still sharp and astute. He immediately thought of a solution. I know that you're able to revive people, bring them back to life, and we will pretend like this matter never happened. My tablet. Return it. Now. Lionel said coldly. Jeffner's expression darkened. So this was what this was about. Revive her first, then we can discuss this matter. She will remain dead. Jeffner and the others were stunned into silence. They thought that maybe Lionel would demand to see his tablet first. Maybe he would talk about not trusting them to keep their word. Maybe he would try to work out some other deal. But what they never thought was that he would respond like this. He didn't want to revive her. He would revive her. He had given her 3 seconds, and she didn't cherish it. What right did she have to live after offending him? What right did she have to revive when he couldn't do the same for his father? The dead should remain dead. Jeffner didn't know how to reply, but his fury did. It continued to bubble upward, threatening to spill over. Whether he interacted with the world or not, he understood the kind of weight the title of ancestor brought. And he understood even greater than that what a gap between strength levels represented. No matter how talented Lionel was, even if he had been at the pinnacle of the 7th dimension, bridging the gap to the 8th was absolutely impossible. That was only an understanding that one would gain after touching upon the threshold. How could he allow a child to talk to him like this? But before he could say anything, Lionel nodded. You can all die then. At that moment, 3 starships that had been hovering in the skies made their presence known. They rumbled just a single time, and then their lasers shot out, piercing forward. The laser whizzed by Lionel's ear, a searing heat erupting that would have burned practically anyone else to ashes. The laser was too quick for Jeffner to react. A hole was torn through his head, and his gaze became vacant almost instantly. The remaining 2 ancestors were shocked away, quickly reacted to pull their strengths together, but Lionel had already spoken again. Rise. Jeffner shuddered, and a violet spirit came from his body. It didn't even get a chance to bow to Lionel before it was forced to attack. Tragic cries echoed once again. The 2 remaining ancestors were entirely occupied with waiting for the next strike of the starship. By the time they realized the rest of their family was in danger, it was far too late, and over half of their quasi-8th dimensional experts had been crushed to death beneath Jeffner's might. Lionel continued to walk forward, slipping by the 2 ancestors as though they weren't worth much and entering the depths of the Umber family compound. By the time he came back, bronze tablet in hand, only Jeffner and the 2 ancestors remained. Unfortunately for them, it wasn't easy to deal with an ancestor who could endlessly regenerate. The 2 were on their back legs and struggling mightily against Jeffner's suicidal attacks. He had already been the strongest amongst the 3 of them, which was why he was the first one to speak, and now they were suffering an obvious fate. Fight to the death, Lionel said indifferently, stepping out from the palace and preparing to leave. He didn't have the time to waste here, and he didn't feel like using more of his power on something so insignificant. However, when he stepped out, he found a red-eyed Radlease kneeling by his aunt's corpse. He cared about his aunt greatly, and their relationship had always been extremely close. Although the latter was always teasing him and saying ridiculous things about her beauty, it was exactly that made Radlease love her so much. It could even be said that most of his perversion came from the influence of his aunt. She had practically molded his personality. But now she was dead, and at the hands of a person he had thought was a friend. When he met Lionel's gaze, he thought he would see some helplessness, maybe an understanding that they were simply standing on two separate sides, and that this matter was inevitable, maybe a certain level of understanding for his pain, maybe even a little remorse, but he saw none of that. There was only an endless depth of indifference, as though he saw Radley's emotions as nothing more than a fixture in his life that would pass away given enough time. There was no humanity in there, no care, no sympathy. Radley's was in a complete daze. Could that even be a gaze that a human could have? Did he not understand human emotion? Did he not have a heart? By the time he awoke from his daze, Lionel and his 3 starships had vanished. The Umbra family, filled with hope and expectation for the future, had been razed to the ground. Those that remained alive were only those Lionel felt to be insignificant existences. And of those that were important, only Radley's and Xylem remained, their silence palpable. They were only the first casualty of Lionel's wrath. Chapter 2185. Published at 29th of September, 2023, 9 o'clock and 26 seconds AM. Chapter 2185. Army. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2185. Army. How do you get to the spirituals domain? Lionel called out Wise Star Order, asking him a straightforward question. But this sort of question threw the latter completely off guard. Wise Star Order had practically been ignored by Lionel, so he spent his time training his 2 disciples. He had thought that maybe Lionel would ask them to help during the war, but that time never came. In Lionel's opinion, it wasn't yet the right time to use them, and they wouldn't have been much help to begin with. They wouldn't have changed the outcome. Savants were secret weapons that were best used when the enemy knew nothing about them. Otherwise, it would be possible to plan for their abilities and counter them ahead of time. Once their abilities were countered, savants were no different from mortals. But to call him forward so suddenly and for this reason. Lionel's enlightened self could make it to the spirituals domain with ease, but that was also because Dream Force could envelop an entire domain. It was easy to find entrances to other domains like this. But without this ability, travel was much more difficult. The Void battlefield wasn't just a battlefield, it was also a buffer between regions, and it was incredibly difficult to cross without the right tools. Lionel didn't want to go to other domains now, but he wanted to understand what he had to prepare first. Since Wise Star Order had spent quite a bit of time in the spirituals domain, and had even hidden a great amount of treasures there, he definitely should know how to get there. As expected, after regaining his calm, Wise Star Order gave a brief explanation. It was also about as complex as Lionel had expected, but it wasn't just because of the anarchic force, but rather because the spirituals had gone out of their way to corner themselves off, as though they were some sort of untouchable existence. But it was greater than this for Lionel. They know something. From Wise Star Order, he had gained something he hadn't expected, and he could see a bit of why the spirituals acted the way they did. He could also see just how rare it was for one of them to exit their world, and how much importance they had placed on his father for one of them to show up, especially since I was their emperor. Lionel slotted this to the back of his mind. Given what his father had done to King, there would very soon be huge changes to these simulations. However, due to the time dilation between the worlds, where even a few split seconds was years, it was hard to tell when exactly it was this would happen. Or it might very well be possible that they could adjust the time dilation at their will to mitigate these factors. Regardless, he had to be faster, sharper. Lionel waved Wise Star Order off and left swiftly, not looking back and leaving the extraordinarily handsome man in a bit of a state of shock. In the blink of an eye, this young man had caught up to him, but it was worse than that. Wise Star Order felt that now, even if he racked his mind for schemes, catching Lionel off guard would be absolutely impossible. All he could see was death. If he even tried, the afterlife was all that awaited him after all these years of living. Lionel didn't even feel the need to worry about him anymore. And that was despite the fact his father was no longer here to ensure his safety. Wise Star Order sighed. He wasn't sure what to do. Did he really have to give up all of his hopes and aspirations? Lionel entered the lab setting, but the region had stepped into was one that only himself and Aina had been in. No one knew what was here, and even if it was explained to them, they would likely never believe it. And yet here it was. Before Lionel, countless human-sized tubes filled to the brim with light blue liquid floated. There were easily millions of them. The space simply felt endless. But what was more important than these fluid-filled tubes was what was within them. Demons. As far as the eye could see, countless demons rested within these test tubes, waiting to be awakened. At the very forefront of these demons was one that Lionel recognized intimately. It was a beautiful blue-scaled demon with a flesh hood that connected its shoulders and the top of its head. Every time it breathed, a tongue would slither out, snapping at the air and colliding against the body of the tube, causing it to shake and quake despite the fact it was formed of nigh indestructible materials. That was right, this was none other than the Cobra Demon, the very demon that had eaten him alive. Not just one of them, but over 10,000. And this. What nothing more than just a single one of Lionel's troops, each of which he had forged a special unit binding armor for. This was the handiwork of the tentacle womb, a process that had taken many years to finish. This was an army that he had planned to unleash to protect the Morales family from the onslaught of the wider human domain. But now their purpose had changed. The Morales had pissed him off greatly. If the Umbra family had seen this army, it was hard to tell how they would react. If they were paired with the starships, it was hard to say if there was a single army in the human domain that could deal with them properly. They were existents that were nigh undefeatable in the seventh dimension, and now they were about to be released on the world. If such an army just had the backing of a handful of ancestors, just how powerful would they be? Lionel took a step and exited the lab setting. He found Aina standing, seemingly waiting for him. "Let's go, we're returning to the Morales family." Aina didn't say much and only nodded, the two of them vanishing. Alienor followed along, the family of three moving toward a behemoth of the human domain. Chapter 2186. Published at 29th of September, 2023, 9 o'clock and 21 seconds AM. Chapter 2186. Encirclement. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2186. Encirclement. The atmosphere of the Morales family was odd. The death of Velasco wasn't lost on them. It was only after he was gone that they seemed to understand just how much of a looming presence he was. Long before Lionel, there was Velasco, and it could be said that the amount of pride and joy he had brought the Morales family despite his personal attitude issues was impossible to measure. How long had he been the symbol of the Morales? The untouchable expert who stood above them all? Even though he didn't hold any power in the family, he was subconsciously understood to be their most powerful expert, and as a result, he was likewise a badge of projection. The Morales family was powerful enough in their own right, but anyone who wanted to do something to them needed to think twice, and then thrice, not just because of them, but because of what that one man might do. The day of Velasco's rampage was something that had left a scar on the whole of the human domain. It was something they all remembered profoundly, and it was something that the Morales had hung their hat upon for the longest time. And now, that man was gone. Subconsciously, they all felt a little less safe, a little less confident, a little less prideful. That sort of emptiness wasn't something that even the ancestors could immediately contest against. Despite their best efforts, the somber atmosphere was heavy, mixing into the once happy and jovial atmosphere, and creating an odd mixture. It was impossible for there to be 100% acceptance of a matter in a family that was so large. And there were of course some who simply didn't care, and even some who felt that a scourge was finally gone. Many of those being members of the older generation. Lionel didn't feel anything different when he entered the Morales family. He wasn't very familiar with it, nor did he have any close feelings of familiarity with it. It was already much different from the first time he had been here, but once again he didn't seem to care much. Rather than reporting to the central region of the Morales family territory, Lionel had other plans, and that was of course to finally allow little Tali to evolve. In order to pick the perfect evolution path for the little one, he needed a force eruption. Force eruptions were the method by which worlds evolved. They pumped a world with a large amount of higher quality force than it was used to, but as a result, they were also quite dangerous. The last time Lionel had been caught up in the force eruption, he had to fight tidal waves of beasts, and because he had been on an island at the time, oceanic beasts got involved and caused a great deal of damage to the land. He didn't think about those memories much, though, mostly because the friends that he had made on that island had all died due to the terrain invasion. War was a cruel thing, and people died. It was a blunt and all too obvious truth. But Lionel had always been good at ignoring it. At least when it didn't involve the people who had large pieces of his heart. Clearly there was no avoiding it now. These matters, though, weren't on Lionel's mind at all. He didn't care about the danger, nor did he care about those that had died all that time ago. Instead, he was more interested in finding the location of such a force eruption. Luckily, they weren't hard to find at all. The Morales world had been a seventh-dimensional world previously for many generations. It had long since reached the end of its potential, and if not for Lionel, it would have never crossed over to reach an eighth-dimensional world. It had to be remembered that Earth was supposed to be the only world in the human domain with eighth-dimensional potential. This aside, as a result of this, the Morales world was impossibly vast, covering several sectors. In order for such a large region to enter the eighth dimension, the number of force eruptions necessarily was uncountable. It wasn't long before Lionel was able to find one. He just needed to map out the regions of force from lowest concentration to highest, and move toward the flow of the latter. Once the force eruptions ended, the force would equalize. But for now, things were still very much imbalanced. Controlling the segmented cube shuttle, Lionel whizzed toward the force eruption. The segmented cube shuttle mode was sleek and powerful, formed of jigsaw pieces of black and radiant blue. It looked like an enigma racing across the skies. The moment Lionel got into range of the force eruption, though he sensed that his shuttle was locked down upon by several auras, Lionel didn't need to think very hard to understand what was happening. In such a situation, especially one so unexpected, there would of course be many bad actors. Evolving into an eighth-dimensional world involved much more than just force, but resources as well, and many of these resources were concentrated in regions of force eruptions as well. If the Morales were smart, they would of course leave guards in these regions, stopping both fellow Morales and bad actors from other families from taking advantage. However, Lionel simply didn't care. He was the patriarch of this family supposedly. He didn't feel any sort of guilt. Though, even if he wasn't the patriarch, it would be hard to say if he had the capacity to feel such a thing at the moment at all. The segmented cube was much too fast after entering the ninth dimension. Lionel knew without a doubt that there was no one in this world that could catch him in this shuttle. So how could he not get by a mere encirclement of a few? He zipped by, leaving them in his dust. However, it was clear that this matter wouldn't end so simply. And maybe Lionel didn't want it to either. You're tuning in to the Lee May's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.